Of this Easter holiday is the ongoing war. However, this year, it's the second year in a row that both Russia and Ukraine have declared an Easter ceasefire. However, historically, both sides have accused the other of multiple thousands of infractions. Yet still, no doubt, it provides some respite for people celebrating this weekend. Also marking the holiday was the exchange of 182 Ukrainians who returned back onto Ukrainian soil in an exchange with Russia earlier on Saturday. Now, while this ceasefire continues through the weekend and there has been the invitation to continue it beyond the holiday, both sides and people, at least here in Ukraine, remain extremely skeptical about whether it will hold at all. Audrey McAlpine, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and rival Peter Magyar will hold their final rallies in the coming hours before Sunday's elections. The vote is seen as the biggest threat to Orban's 16-year grip on power. On Friday, 100,000 people in Budapest turned up to a concert that doubled as a call for people to vote Orban out. His declining popularity, especially amongst young people, follows economic stagnation, as well as political and corruption scandals. Joining us live now from Budapest is Zsuzsanna Weg, who is a political analyst and associate researcher for Hungary at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you with us. Why has Viktor Orban suddenly become so vulnerable after so many years of political dominance?
There has been already a lot of frustration with the Fidesz government already when we headed into the previous election, but the opposition was very fragmented and the frustration was not channeled into one party. That changed 2 years ago when the current opposition leader Péter Magyar entered the scene, and he managed to capture a momentum that then pulled together both the traditional opposition voters of the left and the liberal parties, and also could attract the disillusioned right-wing Fidesz voters behind one party, and that is why now Fidesz faces one single strong challenger.
Péter Magyar himself is no political moderate, but how has he tapped into the previous opposition, what the previous opposition challengers have failed to do?
What he managed to tap into, apart from the political frustration with the erosion of democracy, is also a growing...
Ni fahari mimi kuwa sehemu kubwa ya maendeleo ya uchumi wa nchi yangu. Kwa watu wachapakazi, sekta ya usafirishaji ni kitu muhimu sana kwenye kurahisisha maendeleo yetu. Na kuhakikishia mimi na Watanzania wenzangu tunatumia magari bora tunayoagiza kutoka SBT Japan kwenye shughuli zetu za uchumi wa kila siku. SBT Japan kwa magari bora zaidi.
Join the 9th anniversary. Come build your own pocket city. Turn demo skills into city landmarks. Develop zones to unlock the 1 million treasury. Your empire awaits. Build your legacy in Pocket City.
To vote is extremely important to keep the lead that we see in the polls. So if people suddenly start to feel that, oh, it's a done deal, that will disadvantage the opposition party. At the same time, for Fidesz, it also is crucial because there will be many close districts. So ultimately, it's very hard to say who would benefit from it. Both need it.
Zsuzsanna, I have about a minute left on the program here. What would an Orban defeat mean for Europe's nationalist and populist right? And more importantly, perhaps, what would it mean for Brussels, Moscow and Washington if one of Europe's most prominent nationalist leaders was voted out?
It would definitely break the illusion that Orban built a system in which he is undefeatable. I don't think it would particularly undermine the success of other far-right parties in other countries. They are driven by their own domestic concerns. But for the European Union, it would be a big shift because a Magyar government would bring about a more constructive attitude and a more collaborative approach towards the EU.
Shoshana, really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us, Shoshana Ved, in Budapest.
Thank you very much for having me.
Libya has approved its first unified state budget in more than 13 years. Tripoli and Benghazi agreed on the $38 billion budget. Libya is a major oil producer, and it has long been split between rival administrations in the east and west. Both sides have been operating without a national budget. The first lunar voyage in more than half a century has ended with a dramatic splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. All 4 astronauts from the Artemis II mission are safe. They went further into space than any human has gone before. Al Jazeera's Joel Evans reports.
A historic 10-day mission around the moon and back again, the first in more than 50 years.
Splashdown confirmed at 7:07 p.m.
Sighs of relief as the Artemis II team splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. Re-entering the atmosphere at almost 40,000 kilometers per hour, the Orion space capsule hurtled towards Earth. As it did, plasma buildup cut all communications for 6 minutes, and the capsule glowed orange and yellow. Outside, temperatures on the heat shield shot towards 2,700 degrees Celsius. This was the most dangerous part of the mission that had set new records.
And there go the first series of parachutes.
You are inspiring. That is not...
The Orion space capsule carried 4 astronauts further from Earth than any other human had traveled before, in a journey of over 400,000 kilometers. The USS John P. Merthyr was on the scene to recover the space capsule. Medical officers entered the Orion space capsule and confirmed all 4 astronauts were safe before they were allowed to exit onto the raft and were airlifted one by one to the nearby ship.
As we begin to hoist
The mission signals the beginning of a new era of space travel and demonstrates new capabilities needed for future missions into deep space.
Second astronaut now off the front porch.
Now safely back home, it may take a few days for Commander Reed Wiseman and his team to get used to life back on Earth. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera.
There's more on all the stories we've been covering here at aljazeera.com. I'll be back in less than 2 minutes with more of our extensive coverage of the talks between the US and Iran. See you then.
The latest news as it breaks.
Despite the ceasefire, the situation here is very chaotic as the Israeli army opened fire and assaulted the eastern part of central Gaza.
With detailed coverage.
According to UN human rights monitors, short-range drone killings went up 120% last year.
From around the world.
When the Strait of Hormuz is choking, well, the economies here are gasping for air.
Hard-hitting interviews.
Aren't you afraid that you might be one of the targets?
Anyone could become a target. We have seen that they have no hesitation about targeting any place.
Facing realities.
Does Qatar still trust Iran enough to mediate?
Let's say that this aggression brings a benefit for no one.
Thought-provoking answers.
How many have been displaced inside Iran?
I've heard 3 million. It could be more.
Hear their story on Talk to Al Jazeera.
Everywhere you look, a scene of complete and utter devastation. 73,000 homes were either damaged or completely destroyed. 100 people plus were killed.
Police had managed to hold these protesters at this intersection. There is a bus parked nearby ready to take people away if they're arrested, and officers have their handcuffs ready. They are prepared.
It is 16 GMT. Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Al Jazeera, live from Doha, with our extensive coverage of the high-level negotiations between the US and Iran. The latest, face-to-face talks between the US and Iran in Pakistan are underway. Tehran says that it's open to dialogue, but doesn't trust the United States. The US delegation is led by Vice President J.D. Vance, who said he's optimistic about the outcome of negotiations. More death and destruction in southern Lebanon. Israel continues its strikes despite an agreement for talks with Lebanon. Ukraine and Russia exchange prisoners as a temporary ceasefire goes into effect to coincide with the Orthodox Easter. The White House has confirmed the US, Iran and Pakistan are holding face-to-face talks in Islamabad to end the war. These are the highest-level negotiations between Washington and Tehran since Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Tehran's delegation is led by the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Ahead of the talks, they set preconditions, including the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets and an end to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. Iran's government spokesperson says that Tehran is open to dialogue. Vice President J.D. Vance and his team have met with the Iranian delegation. The U.S. wants the Strait of Hormuz to be open for oil tankers and other vessels without limitations. Before the negotiations, Washington said that it's open to significant sanctions relief, but only in exchange for Iranian concessions on nuclear development. These talks come after Israel and the U.S. launched attacks on Iran 6 weeks ago. More than 3,000 Iranians have been killed and at least 26,500 people injured since the start of the war. Attacks have also struck multiple civilian facilities, including hospitals, universities, and schools. And the conflict has also had widespread effects across the world. We have correspondents this hour in southern Lebanon, near Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, in Tehran, and in Islamabad. And we begin in Pakistan, where the talks are taking place at Al Jazeera's Osama bin Javed. So much at stake right now in Islamabad, Osama. What are the expectations and the immediate challenges?
Well, I think the expectations are still positive here in Islamabad. We've been hearing from a number of officials on the condition of anonymity, because what you see here in Pakistan right now is that officials have been asked not to speak to the media because they want to play this role of not having anything to do with the outcome of the talks. The first round happened for about just under 2 hours. There was a break for dinner, and we believe that these negotiations have begun again. Both sides have been going in with the maximalist positions. You heard from the Iranians saying that there is mistrust, and they're going onto the table with deep mistrust because they've been attacked twice in the past. And the Pakistanis have told us that they are seeing this as a historic day because they've been able to mediate a face-to-face meeting at the highest level. Remember, there have been multiple rounds of talks at various venues, whether it was Geneva, Oman, or Abu Dhabi. But this is the first time they're actually meeting each other. Although there has been some progress, we are told, that has been made on the issue of Israeli attacks in Lebanon, on the issue of unfreezing those assets that Iran desperately needs, and also on various other issues, including the Strait of Hormuz as well. So we're hearing good and positive vibes from the meeting, from the sources we're speaking to. But again, as diplomats tell us, that diplomacy is best done behind closed doors, and only when they come out of the room will actually find out what was achieved.
When they come out of the room, do we know how long these talks are going to go on for?
Well, one analyst I was speaking to just told me that this going into pretty late hours is a good sign. Anything that we were expecting that this is going to be a short visit by the U.S. Vice President. It's going to be a few hours at best, and then they are going to meet again or think about a strategy of going forward. But them meeting once, going over dinner, and then meeting again is, according to many analysts, a positive sign. As I mentioned, there have been a number of things that have been agreed upon as well. So it is being viewed as both sides willing to make concessions. The Iranians, you've heard from the Iranian government that expert level talks are happening right now. You've heard from the Americans that they are serious and they will be going in with an open hand if the Iranians are serious. So from the Pakistani perspective, this is all well and good, and we're expecting that these talks could last for a few hours and could perhaps go into late hours of the evening as well. It will all depend on how serious those negotiations are, what is each side willing to give, and what will be the mechanism going forward.
Al Jazeera's Osama bin Javed reporting live there from Islamabad. Many thanks, Osama. Let's go live down to Tehran. Al Jazeera's Ali Hashim is there. Help us understand, Ali, what is being said there in Tehran about what these talks realistically can achieve.
Well, these talks are different from any other talks that took place over the past 47 years between Iran and the United States. It's first talks after a direct war between the two states. And that's why what's on the table is 47 years of hostilities. It's not only about the nuclear program, it's not only about the ballistic program, it's not about the regional axis, it's about the core of the relations between the two states. And of course, for the Iranians, they said it clearly, they want a kind of a peace deal to end this war and not a ceasefire. This is what they've said before. Now that they accepted a ceasefire, they're going also with some chips that they have in their hand. The Strait of Hormuz, weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz, proved to them that it could be their own sort of strategic weapon in dealing with the United States. Now, regardless of all what's on the table, regardless of the gaps, because there are huge gaps when it comes to the understanding of what could be the deal. What the Americans have in mind, we had the president and the vice president talking about having zero enrichment, taking all the Iranian high enriched uranium and not having a ballistic missile or limiting the ballistic missile, stopping the regional leverage on the other side for Iran. They want to still enrich uranium. They still want to be able to control their highly enriched uranium, even if they dilute it. They want to still be able to have a leverage in the region, and they're not going to give up on their ballistic missiles. So we are dealing with a zero-sum situation. However, there are still hopes. The mediators say that there are hopes that they can reach somewhere. Over here in Iran, people also are dealing with this situation, with these negotiations, with a lot of skepticism. There's a pillar of untrust that's holding the tent of this discussions, negotiations, and that's why whoever you ask will just shake their heads, because they don't see a possibility to give an answer, neither yes nor no.
Al Jazeera's Ali Hashim live in the Iranian capital Tehran. Many thanks, Ali. Well, Iran is pushing for the US to release its assets and lift years of sanctions. Washington has signaled openness to easing those measures, but only in exchange for concessions on Tehran's nuclear and missile programs. In 1979, the US imposed sanctions in response to the seizure of the US embassy and its staff in the Iranian capital. They continued because of Tehran's support for armed groups and its nuclear ambitions. Iran wants to regain access to funds held in major global banks, estimated to be worth more than $100 billion. They could help its struggling economy. Nearly half of Iranians live below the poverty line. Since 2025, its economy has struggled with a sharp currency collapse and surging inflation. To discuss this further, joining us once again in the studio, Sultan Barakat, who's a professor of public policy with Hamad bin Khalifa University, and in Lahore is Ijaz Haider, who's a defense and national security analyst. Let's start with you, Professor. We know what the US wants. How easy would that be for Iran to give? You were saying, when we spoke an hour ago, that there is no nuclear program anyway.
Well, there is no
program on the ground, but it is in the minds of the Americans and the Israelis as it's there as a threat. So the Iranians, I think they need to take steps to reassure everyone that this is not the fact, not the reality. And now they're in a much better position than they were a few months ago to do so because of the various destruction that they've suffered, but also because of the international interest, growing interest in the issue. But if I may just go back to the issue of release of assets, because that's quite important as a confidence-building exercise. You know, last year there were negotiations between the Iranians and the Americans that led to the release of 5 prisoners on both sides. And there were assets that were approved to be released, and those were held back. So now I think maybe the Americans have an opportunity to offer that those assets can be already used by the Iranians because they were linked to previous round of talks in order to encourage the Iranians and to build a degree of confidence with them. And it's true that the Americans, and now you can add to that, Abu Dhabi holds billions of dollars for the Iranians. Of course, from the Iranian perspective, it's not enough just to have a ceasefire. They want to have they want to reach a state where they are part of the international community again. So removing the sanctions and releasing the assets is a very important leverage in the hand of the United States at the moment.
Are Iran's demands unreasonable? I mean, if you listen to what the US president...
The global AI market is projected to reach $1.770 trillion by 2032. Do you have the skills needed to seize this opportunity? Build a rewarding career in AI with the postgraduate program in AI and machine learning, business applications. Take the first step towards AI mastery. Apply now.
The energy. It defeats the purpose. If you still have to buy it from somewhere else, what's the point of developing your own independent energy? And it plays into that whole sort of colonial arrangement that you must come to one of us, the big fives plus Israel, to be able to have your program. So and basically they have a point there. The difficulty I think we have with them, particularly in this region, is the way they were totally off target in their actions around the Arab Spring and the way they intervened in a lot of affairs around the Arab world that were totally unnecessary. And now they realize that they've just fueled sectarian conflicts across the region that have now come to bite them again. I mean, they must regret a lot of these interventions. And we saw the way they withdrew from Syria very, very quickly, and I suspect they'll probably do the same with Yemen and elsewhere. That agenda does not help their own national development.
Ijaz Haider, President Trump said earlier on Saturday that the US is actively clearing the Strait of Hormuz. What militarily does that operation involve, and why now? Is it a dangerous moment to do that while talks are underway there in Islamabad?
Well, I mean, President Trump, if he could clear the Strait of Hormuz, frankly, his delegation would not have been in Islamabad. Of course, I'm not saying that clearing and cleansing the Strait of Hormuz is the only factor here. But operationally speaking, the kind of assets that he would need to deploy, especially if they also have to confront the Iranian response, it'll be extremely difficult. I mean, we know that he's already been calling upon various other countries, including his NATO allies, has been really cut up with them for not responding to that. So I don't think it's something that can be done easily and without a cost. I also believe that at this point in time, it's more about bluster than anything else. He's desperately trying to sell the idea that this war that he started, which essentially is Netanyahu's war, who sold it to him, is something that, the Americans or the United States of America has gotten something out of this, which obviously is not right. It's incorrect. And I mean, people know this, even in the United States. There's so much, criticism of this war and how this has been conducted. But I don't think that this is the time for him to actually go for something like this. There was a lot of talk about shallow ground incursions taking over the Kharg Island or some of the coastal areas. This rescue op that they mounted and the cost that they had to pay for that obviously also played an important role in determining operationally that this is not something that can actually happen. But the important thing is...
Very briefly, because time is tight, given everything that has happened in recent weeks, the escalation we saw beforehand, how much of an achievement is it as far as Pakistan is concerned, simply to have got these two sides in a room and talking face to face?
It's important. I mean, Pakistan has been working the phones. They've been in contact with the Iranians. They've been in contact with President Trump and his team. They're trying to get both sides together. It's a big breakthrough in many ways that they're going to have direct talks. Up until now, whenever there have been talks, they've been indirect, except, when there was the bond process. So it's important. But essentially, the idea is there a mutually hurting stalemate here? That's one thing. Secondly, is there a mutually enticing opportunity here? I mean, Mr. Barakat just talked about this, and I think he's absolutely correct. The point really is that there is a lot of distance between the American and the Iranian positions when it comes to enrichment, when it comes to missiles, when it comes to what is called proxies, but what I would refer to as Iranian allies. So Iran definitely wants sanctions lifted, but Iran also has to have the enrichment capability, which under Article 4 of the NPT, read in conjunction with Articles 1 and 2, is an inalienable right of every state, including the ones that have signed the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. So that point is there, and legally, Iran is on a strong footing. So these talks have to somehow bring these two issues together: sanctions relief and keeping the right to enrich.
Okay.
Now, Iran has been saying that we'll downblend the 60% that was enriched, the 440 kg that everyone's talking about. But whether the Americans are going to accept that, we'll have to see that.
Professor, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or perhaps the elephant that isn't in the room, because Israel isn't there. Of course, Iran insists that Lebanon must be part of any wider ceasefire arrangement. Israel rejects that outright. I mean, how much of a problem is Israel going to be to these negotiations?
It's absolutely central. I mean, the whole tension between Iran and Israel started with Israel invading Lebanon in 1978 and then in 1982, which led to the creation of Hezbollah, supported by Iran, and got them in direct confrontation. Before that, there were no problems between Iran and Israel. And under the Shah, it was the opposite. They were friends. So Israel is central, and the Palestinian issue and the Israeli agenda of expansion is also important if we are going to have long-term stability in the region. And I think this is very clear to the Iranians, and it's also clear to the Israelis, who fear that lifting the sanctions of Iran would really unleash greater power against Israel. I mean, all what we saw in terms of missile development and the ability to reach so many, thousands of kilometers and so on, all of that happened under sanctions. Can you imagine that this has been the strictest sanctions ever? And this country has managed to develop all that technology. So from the Israeli perspective, they say, well, if you lift the sanctions and if we allow them to become one other nation amongst the rest, then we are under greater threat. So they still see it from their perspective. And I think Netanyahu in particular will do everything to derail the possibilities of talks. He would like to keep this tension very high, maybe not direct war ongoing, but he needs the US to continue to commit to security in the region, to stand up to Iran on his behalf. And more so, he needs the Arab states to continue to lose billions of dollars in addressing a threat that is not necessarily their first problem. So it's not in his interest to see these talks going on. It's not in his interest to see sanctions being lifted in any form of the Iranians at the moment.
Good to talk to you again, Professor. Many thanks indeed. Sultan Barakat and Ijaz Haider in Lahore. Thanks to you both. Lebanon says that Israeli attacks have to stop before ceasefire talks can begin. Hezbollah has rejected a return to earlier arrangements, and Israel is expanding its occupation of the south. As civilian casualties grow, hopes for a de-escalation are slim. Al Jazeera's Zaina Hodder reports from Beirut.
Israeli strikes keep coming. There is no ceasefire in Lebanon. The government says Israel must stop these attacks before it will engage in direct peace negotiations with Israel. And Iran has made the same demand. Speaker of Parliament Mohammed Bakr Kalibaf insists that for a regional ceasefire to hold, it has to extend to the Hezbollah-Israel front. In a written statement, Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem said the group will not agree to return to the previous situation. He's referring to the 2024 ceasefire. Israel's military was supposed to end its attacks and presence in South Lebanon. Instead, Israeli forces occupied up to 10 square kilometers, an area they are now trying to expand. Israel says this is a war against Hezbollah, but casualties among civilians keeps rising. Few believe the government has any leverage over Israel, but the offer to hold talks is being seen as an attempt to weaken Iran's influence over Lebanon. Hezbollah's supporters are angry at the government, which appears ready to make peace and disarm a group they believe is defending the country.
Hezbollah fighters on the front line are the ones who should negotiate, only them.
We reject the negotiations, and we don't even have a state to negotiate on our behalf. This is not a state. It's acting on the orders of Israel and the United States.
So much has already been lost in Israel's attacks. Those who do survive salvage what they can. But this fractured nation doesn't speak in one voice, and without a consensus within Lebanon, it won't be easy to implement any deal. Zaina Hodder, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Israeli airstrikes have intensified across southern Lebanon, with at least 10 people reported killed. Residential areas in the Nabatea district have been hit as attacks spread across several towns. Health officials say that homes, infrastructure, and civilian facilities have been heavily damaged. Rescue teams are continuing to assess the damage and search affected areas. We'll get the Israeli government's perspective in just a few moments, but first let's speak to Al Jazeera's Abeda Hito, who's live for us in Tyre in southern Lebanon. What's the situation where you are, Abeda?
Well, at sunset, the situation has not de-escalated at all. There are still jets flying in the sky, as well as a drone that's been humming above our heads for the last several hours. We've seen Israeli troops carry out controlled demolitions in Naqoura, as well as Shemet here in the southwest front, in these coastal towns where Israeli troops are present. We've also seen Hezbollah launch their own attacks towards Israeli troops and over the blue line into Israeli territory. The situation continues to remain quite tense here. I was talking to a gentleman about a half hour ago, and he was saying that he was extremely concerned seeing the jets flying over this area of Tyre, because his sister was still in one of these villages that are being attacked on a daily basis. I asked him why she hadn't left yet. He said that she didn't want to leave, that she didn't have anywhere else to go, and that she felt better staying in her home. And that's the case for not a lot of people, but some Lebanese people who feel like no matter where they go in Lebanon today, they are not safe from being targeted by Israeli attacks. The situation definitely has not de-escalated, and there is no ceasefire currently in Lebanon or here in the south.
Al Jazeera's Abeda Hito reporting live from Tyre in southern Lebanon. Well, southern Lebanon has been heavily affected by Israeli military operations in recent years. Newly verified satellite images show widespread destruction across several villages. Amnesty International says that more than 10,000 structures were destroyed between October 2024 and January 2025. The group accuses Israel of targeting civilian sites, including schools and hospitals. It says this could amount to war crimes. Live now to Al Jazeera's Noor Odeh, who is in the occupied West Bank and is monitoring the Israeli government's reaction. Israel refusing to negotiate, Noor, with Hezbollah. Do these negotiations with the Lebanese government that are supposed to take place on Tuesday look promising?
Well, I mean, it's really difficult to give a complete assessment, Adrian, but what we know is this. The Israeli government didn't announce that it was ready for negotiations because it wanted to. It was compelled to. The main Israeli daily Haaretz said that the Israeli Prime Minister received instructions from the U.S. President to do just that, to dial down the attacks on Lebanon, to stop attacking Beirut. So that is important context to understand how this meeting is going to take place in D.C. The Israeli conditions for these negotiations, for these talks, are maximalist, to say the least. They want to dismantle Hezbollah, even if it takes force by the Lebanese government. Now, this is unrealistic, and the Lebanese government cannot possibly agree to it, as we've heard repeatedly. They want to not talk about leaving southern Lebanon, and that is also another hurdle for Lebanon. It's very important that these talks are not just about a ceasefire. They're about ending the invasion, liberating the occupied part of Lebanon, stopping the systematic destruction that you were talking about a bit earlier. So the two parties are apart. They're basically coming together because that meeting is required for the success of efforts in Pakistan right now between Iran and the United States.
Domestically, how is all that's going on right now playing out for Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Painfully. The Israeli Prime Minister is suffering. The latest polls show that his numbers have gone down considerably. And not only that, he's losing to another right-wing figure, which means that he's competing within the same pool of voters and losing quite a lot of seats. If elections are held today, according to the polls, the Israeli Prime Minister would lose to Naftali Bennett, a former Prime Minister and another right-wing figure. And that puts him in a very precarious situation. He's basically boxed himself into his own rhetoric, the rhetoric about absolute victory, about dismantling and crushing Hezbollah, about taking over southern Lebanon and creating a no-go zone free of the Lebanese and their homes and their buildings and so on. All of that is now, sounds and looks more and more unfeasible. And according to the generals, even if the army was allowed to do all of that, and even if the U.S. doesn't pressure Israel into stopping this invasion, that still won't achieve what Netanyahu has promised the Israeli public without a political horizon.
Al Jazeera's Noor Odeh reporting live from the occupied West Bank. Noor, many thanks. Al Jazeera has gained exclusive access to videos of Iranian attacks on the world's largest LNG exporting facility here in Qatar. Iranian missiles hit the Ras Laffan industrial complex on March 18th, causing significant damage. The attack took out 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity. The state energy company says that it will take 3 to 5 years of repairs to return to full production. Myanmar is among the nations hardest hit by the energy crisis caused by the Iran war. Petrol prices there have more than doubled, driving up food prices and pushing humanitarian aid to breaking point. Even before the current situation, the UN estimated that 20% of the population faced food shortages. Jack Barton reports.
Lines stretching for hours at fuel stations across Myanmar. Even when drivers reach the pumps, there are limits.
I queued all night, and in the morning, I only got $14 worth of fuel. What can I do with $14? Nothing. Pushing from one station to another, it's pure misery.
Myanmar imports 95% of its energy needs. It began fuel rationing a week after the US and Israel attacked Iran. Since then, prices have more than doubled. Facing losses, some drivers have stopped their runs, while others keep going, knowing people depend on their goods.
We transport a lot of consumer goods and food products.
It's led to high inflation in a country already reeling from 5 years of civil war.
The price hikes are driven by transportation costs and high prices at the source. When the cost of goods goes up, everything else follows in a chain reaction.
This paramedic, who does not want to be identified, says the shortages do not spare those who cannot afford to wait.
There are times we can't get to a fire or pick up a patient because the tank is empty. It's a desperate feeling.
Aid organizations warn that deliveries of humanitarian assistance are now severely limited. Myanmar's government says it is exploring tax cuts on fuel imports. But with fuel scarce, food prices rising, and aid struggling to get through, those who were already going hungry face a harder road ahead. Jack Barton, Al Jazeera.
It's good to have you with us. Hello, this is Al Jazeera, live from Doha with our extensive coverage of the talks between the US and Iran. Let's remind you of the latest developments. The White House has confirmed that the US, Iran and Pakistan are holding face-to-face talks in Islamabad to end the war. Tehran says it's open to dialogue but doesn't trust Washington. Iran's delegation said that it had set preconditions for the US before the talks. US Vice President J.D. Vance is leading the delegation from Washington. He's accompanied by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. And Lebanon says that attacks must stop before any ceasefire talks with Israel can begin. Hezbollah has rejected a return to earlier arrangements. Meanwhile, Israeli airstrikes have intensified across southern Lebanon, with at least 10 people reported killed. Let's go live now to Islamabad. Our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, is there for us. Kimberly, give us a sense of the tones that this American delegation was trying to set going into these talks.
Well, they're trying to set a different tone than the one that keeps being amplified by the U.S. President Donald Trump back in Washington. What I can tell you, or back in the United States to be precise, what I can tell you is that he is continuing to try and inject himself into these discussions with his social media posts. They're nothing that he hasn't said before, but just it is an example of how the U.S. president tries to remain relevant when he feels that others are getting more attention. In this case, that would be his delegation engaging in some of the most significant talks since 1979 with the Iranian counterparts. So what we're seeing is the U.S. president tweeting or truthing, in this case, on his Truth Social platform, railing at the U.S. media, calling it the fake news media, but again, underscoring what he believes is significant, and that is that the United States has completely destroyed Iran's military, including their entire Navy and Air Force and everything else. Their leadership is dead, the Strait of Hormuz will soon be open, and the empty ships are rushing to the United States to load up. What he means there is that he is once again trying to not only tell the American public, but also the world that this was worth it, that this was something that was accomplished. But we know, in fact, that things are farther apart than they were before the conflict, given the fact that the goal had been to try and make sure that Iran never gained a nuclear weapon. But now, in addition, the other primary goal of the United States is to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is open, something that was open prior to this conflict. So the U.S. president is, if you will, kind of weighing down on the atmosphere here, which is already very tense in terms of anticipation and the timeline But as well, we should point out that things have been progressing well, and given the fact that it's being led by J.D. Vance, the vice president, who arrived here very relaxed, it is a challenge for those who are in the room negotiating with the U.S. president, kilometers upon kilometers away, trying to inject himself into the process.
Yeah, and along with the vice president, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are both at those talks. They're also the men who were at the table in Geneva just 48 hours before the February strikes on Iran. How is that delegation managing Iran's intense distrust of them?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, how Pakistan is handling it, and that is with heavy security. Just trying to get around Islamabad is challenging. The whole city is on lockdown. The armed forces are out, the police are out, and they all have heavy weaponry that are strapped alongside them. So it is amidst this that the delegation is working behind those security perimeters in order to try and accomplish something. But as you point out, there was a deal to limit Iran's nuclear program. It had been struck by Oman, and it said the deal was within reach, only for the United States to begin firing its missiles at Iran and breaking this up. Until now, we have more than a month of conflict, and now it's up to not only J.D. Vance, but as you point out, the Middle East envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to try and end this. But the problem is that two of the people that were instrumental in it starting are in that same room, and that's why this is being led by J.D. Vance. But again, there is a trust deficit that exists between these two sides, one that is ever more challenging to close, given the fact that Iran is skeptical about the good-heartedness nature of both Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, not to mention their strong ties to Israel, which are also of grave concern.
Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett reporting live from Islamabad. Many thanks, Kimberly. The two-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran has led to optimism about the Strait of Hormuz and that it may reopen soon, but traffic remains at a fraction of normal levels and hundreds of ships are still stranded. Kulsum Sharif reports.
Before the war, more than 100 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's more than 36,000 tankers a year. Now, 20% of global oil and natural gas pass through this critical waterway. But Iran's effective closure of it has stranded hundreds of oil tankers and other ships in the Gulf. Now, this is what we can see since Tuesday, the day of the ceasefire. And this image is from marinetraffic.com that lets us track vessel movements in real time. And what we see here is very little movement around the bend, but we see many ships that are stranded on either side. Now, before the truce was announced, US President Donald Trump had said reopening the strait was a requirement for any deal. Now, Tehran, for its part, says the passage of ships needs to be coordinated with its military. Now, the state news agency has released this map from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. It basically outlines a new route for ships to take. To simplify, I have this image here. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard are basically saying that ships need to sail through Iranian waters right around Larak Island and pass out this way and avoid the earlier normal path for the risk of naval mines. So the new path is effectively this way. Tehran has also indicated under a new permanent deal, they would seek to charge a fee for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Tehran's effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz since the start of the war has continued to roil energy markets, and supplies have further been hit with attacks on energy infrastructure right across the region, from Saudi Arabia, the world's largest crude oil exporter, to Qatar, a global leading LNG exporter.
Joining us in the studio now, once again, Dania Tafa, who is the Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And with us is Alexandru Huristanu, who's a military defense analyst. Welcome to you both. Now, Dania was here about an hour and a half ago now. I don't know whether you were watching, but you dropped a bombshell in that you said that Israel should also be in the room negotiating with the US and Iran. Why?
It's extremely important. There are three parties to this war, simply put, the US and Israel together against Iran. And to have a negotiation without one of the parties at the table is concerning, because should they come to a deal, how would you guarantee that Israel is going to follow through with that deal? And I think Israel was the state that really wanted this war for many strategic objectives for itself. And now Israel is not at the table for the negotiations. This will allow a degree of plausible deniability when it comes to some sort of agreement, as we are seeing right now. And they're saying that Lebanon was part of the ceasefire deal, and Lebanon is still getting struck until today. So,
and President Trump apparently asked Prime Minister Netanyahu to dial it back as far as Lebanon is concerned. He said he wasn't going to do that until the Lebanese government and the Israeli government talk next week. I mean, what does that tell us about Washington's actual influence over Israel? And if the US and Iran do a deal, whether Israel will comply with it?
I think that is a good question. And I think from the Gulf states' perspective here, that's a major concern, because if Israel was to deny that it's not part of this negotiation, then would Israel attack Iran again in the future? And what does that mean for regional security, the Strait of Hormuz, for the Gulf states? It puts everyone in an awkward position, and therefore it's really important for Israel to be at the table and to sign or agree to whatever deal that comes out of this.
And to be held account. Alexandra, do you agree? Iran insists that Lebanon must be part of any ceasefire arrangement. Israel rejects that outright. Is that now the central obstacle to any broader deal? Should Israel be there in that room negotiating a wider peace deal?
I tend to agree with Dr. Dania here, because what we see now is a potentially strategic fragmentation of the war space. Iran and US entered this war together, but we might see a double track here where Israel tries to keep that plausible deniability, saying we were not at the negotiation table, we were not necessarily involved in this deal between US and Iran, and we still have our own objectives to pursue. So strategically, this is very dangerous, because we might assist to a fragmentation of the war front, and then Israel can say, okay, we are no longer in war with Iran, let's say, based on what US and Iran have negotiated, but we're still in war with our proximity.
So what's going on in Islamabad at the moment? Is it genuine diplomacy or political theatre? Is it a real effort to put an end to things, or just to stop things getting worse?
I think looking at the actors present there and the fact that they entered the same room, even though initially the signals were that they would be in separate room and Pakistani mediators will just pass the messages, it shows true effort, at least. We're maybe not necessarily in the final stages of a negotiation, but for sure we are in the primary stages of a negotiation. That's an important step, because at least the two parties are talking, and most likely they will talk the acute points, the non-negotiables they have between themselves, from those 15 points list on the side of US and the 10 points list on the side of Iran. So I'm thinking this is what's going to happen now, because we have this high-level engagement between US and US and Iran, and for sure they will use this time very efficiently for setting up the stage, leaving probably technical discussion later on for their staff, for their specialized teams.
And Dania, where do Gulf states stand in all of this? Of course, I mean, they've suffered greatly as a result of this conflict, which was nothing to do with them, but they're not in the room either.
Yeah, well, the Gulf states want to make sure they achieve some sort of security guarantee out of this war. And so that goes back to my point about Israel, because Israel is the most likely actor to attack Iran in the future. They do have this concept they call mowing the lawn, for example. The Gulf states are actually seeking reparations for the damages, the infrastructure damages that happened across the Gulf, and Qatar is also looking at that. And this is something that Kuwait sought from Iraq from the first Gulf War. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns from the Gulf states' perspective, but really all of this is a strategic loss if the Strait of Hormuz remains under the Iranians' control. And this is, I think, the most important aspect for the Gulf states. The Gulf states can intercept most of Iranian attacks. Of course, it's destabilizing to have missiles and drones coming in, but it is much more, I think, arguably destabilizing to have the Strait of Hormuz under the Iranian thumb, having leverage over their economies and vetoes over their economies.
And Alexandra, early on Saturday, the president tweeted that the US is now actively clearing the Strait of Hormuz ahead of these negotiations that were taking place. I mean, how dangerous a move is that?
If the mine threat exists and in a sufficient manner, it could be very dangerous. But given the fact that we have a ceasefire in place, and at least on the US and Iran side, seemingly they respect this particular ceasefire, even though there are contestation here with attacks that Iran did even after the ceasefire and so on. US is most likely trying to show that the strait is open based on the initial acceptance of this ceasefire. And I know they have passed 2 ships today, and one is still actively transmitting on the automatic identification system, so it shows presence in the actual strait. It's fairly difficult to do anti-mine warfare, and it's a time-consuming job for sure. So it cannot be done as fast as they are mentioning it.
Alexandra Huristano, Dania Thafa, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a look at what else is happening around the world right now. Iraq's parliament has elected the country's next president. Politicians in Baghdad chose Nizar Ahmadi in a vote on Saturday. It comes after parliamentary elections in November. The former president withdrew from seeking a second term. He said that he wanted to avoid weakening national unity. Let's go live now to Baghdad. Al Jazeera's Mahmoud Abdul Wahed is there for us. Who is Nizar Ahmadi, and why has the selection of the new president been so controversial?
Well, Adrian, first of all, this is a long overdue parliament session that was postponed, delayed, held, and then adjourned several times since early January. By virtue of the Constitution, the election of the President of the Republic should take place within 30 days since the beginning of the parliament session, or the first time the parliament convenes, which was in early December. The election of the President of the Republic should have happened in late December or early January. But rivalries between political parties, and namely the Kurdish parties, has led to postponement of this election. Nizar Ahmadi, a politician from the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan based in Sulaymaniyah, and served as environment minister under the incumbent, or outgoing rather, Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani from 2022 until 2024. He is also known for holding several positions pertaining to advisory to the President of the Republic over the past 5 or 4 years. Now, his selection marks the constitutional also delay, because, as I said, this should have been happened 3 months ago. But as you know, by virtue of the political norm, the informal political norm in the Iraq, in the post-2003 Iraq, by virtue of this informal norm, the Kurds parties take the presidency of the Republic, the Shiite take the premiership, and the Sunni Arabs take the speakership of parliament. But as I said, by virtue of the Constitution, the election of the President of the Republic requires 2/3 of the 302 and 29 parliament members, which is 2/3 of the parliament members. That didn't happen over the past 3 months because, as I said, of rivalries and disagreements between several political parties, namely the Kurdish political parties. What comes next, despite the fact that this is a ceremonial position because the executive authorities take responsibility for everything here in Iraq, mainly the cabinet. But what comes next is the election of the Prime Minister and also the forming of the cabinet.
Al Jazeera's Mahmoud Abdul Wahid reporting live there from Baghdad. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his rival Peter Magyar are set to hold their final rallies before Sunday's parliamentary election. The vote is seen as a major challenge to the right-wing Orban, who's been in power for 16 years. On Friday, 100,000 people gathered for a concert in Budapest. The event doubled as a call for people to vote out the government. Orban's declining popularity follows economic stagnation as well as political and corruption scandals. Zsuzsanna Weg is a political analyst and associate researcher for Hungary at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She says the rise of Peter Magyar in the polls reflects the electorate's biggest concerns.
What he managed to tap into, apart from the political frustration with the erosion of democracy, is also a growing disillusionment with Fidesz because of the economic hardships that the current government couldn't tackle over the past 4 or 5 years. The Hungarian economy has been stagnating since the COVID pandemic. There has been high inflation, and Peter Magyar could very much connect this lack of progress with the massive corruption of the governing party. And in doing so, he also talked to the biggest concerns of the current electorate. That was at some scale missing in the previous opposition parties.
A temporary ceasefire has come into effect between Russia and Ukraine to coincide with the Orthodox Easter holiday. The two countries agreed to pause hostilities for 32 hours. They've said that if either side violates the truce, the other would respond immediately. A similar ceasefire was put in place last year, but both countries accused the other of hundreds of violations. Despite tension over the truce, the two sides each exchanged more than 175 prisoners of war. On Saturday, the United Arab Emirates helped to mediate the deal. At the iconic St. Michael's Cathedral in Kyiv, worshippers gathered to celebrate Orthodox Easter, which is again being observed under the shadow of war. Al Jazeera's Audrey McAlpine reports.
This is St. Michael's Cathedral. It's one of the most famous churches here in the capital, and it's where hundreds of Ukrainians will come to celebrate the Orthodox Easter holiday. They have their Easter baskets that they're taking to come to be blessed by the priest. And if you look over here, you see women selling baked goods, raising money for the army. But that is the reality against the backdrop of this Easter holiday is the ongoing war. However, this year, it's the second year in a row that both Russia and Ukraine have declared an Easter ceasefire. However, historically, both sides have accused the other of multiple thousands of infractions. Yet still, no doubt, it provides some respite for people celebrating this weekend. Also marking the holiday was the exchange of 182 Ukrainians who returned back onto Ukrainian soil in an exchange with Russia earlier on Saturday. Now, while this ceasefire continues through the weekend and there has been the invitation to continue it beyond the holiday, both sides and people, at least here in Ukraine, remain extremely skeptical about whether it will hold at all. Audrey McAlpine, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
An Israeli drone strike has killed 7 Palestinians and wounded several others in central Gaza. It's the latest attack on the Strip. Earlier this week, an Israeli strike killed our Al Jazeera colleague Mohammed Bouchar. Nearly 750 people have been killed in Israeli attacks since a ceasefire began in October. Tarek Abu Azoum reports now from Al Bureij in central Gaza.
Gaza is poised on a knife edge, and Israel is ostensibly adopting a firm
political and military line towards Gaza, and this has been pretty much clear through its mounting military momentum that has been widely recorded since the ceasefire was brokered in October last year. At this site in Al Bureij refugee camp, a group of Palestinians were killed by a drone strike. Here on the ground, we can see the scene of blood mixed with the sand as a result of the airstrike, and the shrapnel that hit this site has been very much obvious here on the ground, and this is where they were sitting, in fact, and we can see that this site has been severely damaged. And at the other end there, the bodies have been brought this morning from Al-Aqsa Hospital in order to be mourned by their families at Al Bureij refugee camp. What has been very remarkable is that this site is too far away from the yellow demarcation line, and we did not hear a justification so far from the Israeli military. Now they are trying to be reunited with their loved ones inside this fragile makeshift tent, say goodbye to their loved ones who have been killed by the Israeli military at this site. So apparently there's no any sort of respite in terms of the Israeli airstrikes, and also in terms of the Israeli clear strategy to keep pounding Gaza, even during a time that's supposed to be a ceasefire, where families are supposed to at least feel a relative sense of alleviation, not just in terms of the humanitarian situation, but also in terms of the security level as well. But on the ground, people are left in limbo, and it seems to be not the last funeral in this traversed territory. Tariq Abu Azzoum, Al Jazeera, from Al Bureij refugee camp, Palestine.
Voters in Benin head to the polls on Sunday to elect a president, once one of West Africa's most stable democracies. The poll follows a failed coup in December. That's raised questions about Benin's political direction. Ahmed Idris reports.
In the port city of Cotonou, these journalists planned their coverage of Benin's presidential election. The editor wants to focus on what matters most to voters.
The fundamental concern is bread and peace. That is first what concerns the Beninese.
Bread because of a growing cost of living crisis, and peace because of attacks by armed groups in the north. But Benin's political landscape has also narrowed since President Patrice Talon first came to power in 2016. There were 33 candidates in that year's race, but in this election, only 2. That's after a recent law effectively locked out most opposition parties. Finance Minister Romuald Wadanyi is widely seen as Talon's anointed successor. He's campaigning on a platform of stability and continued reform.
I believe he knows Beninese expect of him to build on the achievements of the current government that improved the living conditions of the people.
Benin's lone opposition challenger in the race is Paul Hunkwe, and he's trying hard to shake perceptions he's little more than a symbolic contender in a tightly controlled contest.
The government rolls out numbers, yet failed to build schools, or you build hospitals that only certain class can access. That's not progress. You need universal access to education and healthcare.
Beyond campaign rhetoric, it's everyday concerns that's shaping people's opinions about the vote.
President Patrice Talon's urban renewal program has transformed the financial capital Cotonou. But for many Beninese, this election is about more than infrastructure and impressive economic growth. Many people here say they want to see greater political and economic inclusion and answers to lingering questions about December's failed coup.
Many say they will still turn out to vote, but some are less convinced.
They keep asking for our votes, but there's been no change in my life.
And while President Talon's economic record may drive some to the polls, analysts say many others may see no vote for peace and decide to stay home. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Cotonou.
Scott McLean here with more of our extensive coverage in 90 seconds.
the latest news.
We are dealing with an escalated situation as over the past 1-2 weeks, we see more and more attacks on the infrastructural areas of the country.
And in-depth reports.
For many people here, Israel is the factor of complication and complexity in this situation. It's the elephant in the room.
From the heart of the story.
The Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that Iran has accepted the ceasefire and the Iranian troops will oversee the passage in the Strait of Hormuz.
In-depth analysis of the day's headlines. Diplomacy, yet again, was used as a ruse for war. Critical debate.
Who betrayed the table? Who attacked the negotiations for the second time? For the third time during the talks we should be attacked? Who is talking about a greater country for itself? Israel, not Iran.
Iran has been a huge supporter of terrorism over the years. I really have to take exception to the idea that Iran is innocent in this.
Inside Story on Al Jazeera.
President Trump launched the war in Iran a month ago, but does he know how to end it? Now European leaders say they'll help Trump on the Strait of Hormuz, but how much damage will be done to U.S.-European relations long after Trump's epic fury subsides?
Your weekly take on U.S. politics, the bottom line.
This is Al Jazeera with extensive coverage of high-level negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. Coming up, face-to-face talks between the U.S. and Iran in Pakistan get underway. Tehran says it's open to dialogue but does not trust the United States. The U.S. delegation is led by Vice President J.D. Vance, who says he's optimistic about the outcome of negotiations. More death and destruction in southern Lebanon. Israel continues its strikes despite an agreement for talks with Lebanon. And Ukraine and Russia exchange prisoners as a temporary ceasefire goes into effect to coincide with Orthodox Easter. The White House has confirmed the U.S., Iran, and Pakistan are holding face-to-face talks in Islamabad to end the war. These are the highest-level negotiations between Washington and Tehran since Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Tehran's delegation is led by Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Ahead of the talks, they set preconditions, including the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets and an end to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. Iran's government spokesperson says Tehran is open to dialogue. Vice President J.D. Vance and his team have met with the Iranian delegation. The U.S. wants the Strait of Hormuz to be open for oil tankers and other vessels without limitations. Before the negotiations, Washington said it is open to significant sanctions relief, but only in exchange for Iranian concessions on nuclear development. Now, these talks come after Israel and the U.S. launched attacks on Iran 6 weeks ago. More than 3,000 Iranians have been killed and at least 26,500 people injured since the start of the war. Attacks have also struck multiple civilian facilities, including hospitals, universities, and schools. And the conflict has also had widespread effects, of course, across the world. All right. We have correspondents standing by for us in Tehran and Islamabad, but let's begin in Pakistan, where those talks are taking place with our correspondent, Osama bin Javed. So, Osama, the Americans and the Iranians are in the same room. They were, I understand, supposed to be in separate rooms, passing messages between each other. Do we know how exactly the change to face-to-face talks came about?
Well, it is a historic moment here in Islamabad where the Pakistanis are taking credit for convincing these sides to forget their differences for a moment, sit together, resolve what they agree upon, and then move forward. We've been hearing from a number of sources who've been talking about how Pakistan has been trying to convince them to at least extend the ceasefire for a longer period, for the Iranians to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and then work on everything else that is on the table. The Iranian positions have been quite rigid. They've been talking about how there needs to be a ceasefire in Lebanon, how those assets that have been frozen by the United States need to be given back to the Iranians. And now also we're hearing now that there have been multiple rounds of negotiations, talks in a congenial atmosphere where they've also had dinner, and now there's in the process of exchanging notes. We hear from the Iranian side that their delegate level negotiations are underway, and they're going to continue to try and find avenues. One source has told us that there's a push from Pakistan to try and get at least another day, another round, another extension of these talks so they can come to some sort of a conclusive agreement. So far, that has not happened, and as you've been hearing from the Pakistani Prime Minister, this is make or break for lasting peace in the region. So Pakistani diplomats are saying they're still hopeful. They're trying to convince them to give more and to cede more ground, but it will all depend on both sides and their leaderships to figure out how they go about these talks, what will be the mechanism going forward, and now that they've started meeting face-to-face, can they continue doing that?
So, Osama, you reported that there may be some progress on Lebanon and Iranian assets, and as you just pointed out, the Pakistani Prime Minister had really urged both sides to be flexible here. I wonder, based on what you're hearing, are the Pakistanis actually optimistic for a breakthrough here?
Well, if that is one word in Islamabad right now from the corridors of power, whether to talk to military sources, diplomatic sources, or people in the politicians, they're all hopeful that there is something on the table. Now, they don't want to, there's almost a gag order here in Islamabad where no official will speak to you because they don't want to cast any shadow over what is coming between these two sides. So they're hopeful, they're optimistic, and they're trying to convince both sides to continue talking. And that they've said that this is a platform that is available to them, whether they continue tonight, whether they continue next week, or want to come back to Pakistan. According to the hosts, they're ready to host more talks.
All right, let's see what happens. Osama bin Javed for us there in Islamabad. Appreciate the reporting. Let's head over to the White House now, where our correspondent Kimberly Halkett is standing by. Excuse me, let's head over just across the street in Islamabad, where our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett is standing by for us. So, Kimberly, look, negotiations are often about striking a conciliatory tone. That is maybe not the tone being sent out by the U.S. President Donald Trump on his social media site, Truth Social. What has he been saying, and do we know if it's having any impact on these talks?
Well, we're going to get to that in just a second because I want to show you what's behind me. If you can see off in the distance there, that building that has lights all along the top is the Serena Hotel, where these talks have been going on. And I should point out, and I have not been able to confirm this because I've been standing out here, but I am relying on Al Jazeera's live updates that the first phase of historic direct talks between the United States and Iran has now concluded. So what we know is that both sides are exchanging written text aimed at confirming they're on the same page on agreements reached in first round of direct in-person talks, obviously since 1979. And we should also point out that there are some sources who are reporting, again, I cannot personally confirm this, but I have been hearing this extensively, that there is an attempt to unfreeze some of the assets belonging to the Iranians, which we know was of a great desire. So that would be the breaking news that is just coming down, that these talks have concluded for now. The big question becomes, what happens next? Is there going to be a further round of discussions? Are they going to spend the night in the Serena Hotel and get back at it at breakfast? We simply don't know, because I'm finding out in real time, just like everybody else. But what I can tell you is that there is a real desire, given the fact that the U.S. Vice President has made the trip here, a lengthy one that involves not a direct flight, but a stop in Europe for refueling, that this is something that can be moved forward in terms of trying to iron out some of the big issues. For the United States, that looks like limiting Iran's ability to have a nuclear weapon and to get the Strait of Hormuz open. Now, again, we're going to have to dig with our sources to find out what was agreed upon in the hotel behind me there. But what I can tell you is that right now the top line appears to be that the talks have concluded for the moment.
And surely in the next couple of days, there's nothing more important on the vice president's schedule than these talks. But let's see where all this goes. Kimberly, we appreciate the reporting. Let's go to Tehran now. Ali Hashem is standing by for us there. So, Ali, yesterday, the Iranian speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, was threatening not to come to these talks at all until there was a ceasefire in Lebanon and Iranian funds were unfrozen. Well, now, not only are the Iranians there and talking, they're actually in the same room, or at least were in the same room until the talks wrapped up for the day. What do we know about the Iranian approach here in Islamabad?
Well, what we are hearing is that the Iranians were able to get a kind of a guarantee from the American side that the Israeli side is going to decrease its attacks on Lebanon. This is on one side. Then we heard from Iranian media sources on Iranian media outlets that the U.S. is going to unfreeze Iranian funds. But there's nothing that's been confirmed from the other side or even from Israel with respect to Lebanon. Yes, there have been less attacks on Beirut and the southern suburbs, but there's nothing that was announced with respect to a ceasefire. Now, the Iranians here are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one side, they cannot sacrifice their deterrence in the region and their relation with the Lebanese group Hezbollah, especially there's a credibility issue here. On the other side, they cannot ruin a ceasefire because of an external factor. So this issue is creating a lot of pressure, already created a lot of pressure on the Iranian team. Now, given the fact they've met, given the fact they are in the same room and they're planning to have another day, then things are moving. Now, how are they moving? Are they bridging the gaps? What's going to happen with respect to the highly enriched uranium? This is a big question. And the biggest question is what's going to happen with respect to the Strait of Hormuz. Now, we saw reports that there's been an agreement on dividing or co-managing the strait, and the Iranians denied that completely. And on the other side, there have been reports of American vessels passing, military Navy vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz, and the Iranians on the other side also completely denied that. So for the moment, we are in the middle of unconfirmed reports from both sides.
All right, Ali Hashem for us there in Tehran. Ali, thank you. Well, Iran and the U.S. have outlined their conditions for ending the war, but there are some pretty major differences. U.S. media leaks suggest it includes a 30-day ceasefire, while Iran is calling for a complete halt to strikes and guarantees against future attacks. The U.S. wants 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities to be dismantled, Tehran to never develop a nuclear weapon, and to stop the enrichment of uranium. Tehran rules out any restrictions on an enrichment program. The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is a key demand. Iran wants guarantees to exercise sovereignty over the waterway. The U.S. also wants Iran to end its support for regional non-state actors like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. But Iran is demanding the U.S. and Israel stop the war on all fronts, including fighting its regional allies. All right, I'm joined now by Dania Dhafar, Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum, a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and from Islamabad is Maria Sultan. She's the chairperson and president of the South Asian Strategic Stability Institute University and an advisor to Pakistan's Ministry of Defense. Thank you both for being here. Maria, I want to start with you. Can you help us understand what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz right now? You have the Americans saying that they've had 2 ships pass through that strait. The Iranians are denying that that has taken place at all. Based on your knowledge, is it possible, you think, that an American warship could pass through that strait with its defenses safely?
Well, without the Iranians giving a safe passage, it's impossible. Because Maham 7 has got the capacity to not only differentiate between military vessels, but also between commercial vessels. And this is one of the major reasons that UAE's military fleet has not left the bay and has not gone into Strait of Hormuz to clear it.
And just to clarify, so there's nothing on board an American warship that would be able to shoot down whatever incoming the Iranians might fire their way?
It's not a question of fighting the way, it's a question of understanding what's under the water. And the Iranian Midget-class submarines are underwater, and they are the ones which are laying down the mines. And then they have got an entire strategy which is built around UAVs, it's built around, drones, and also coastal defense. So unless and until the Iranians do not give a safe passage, it's impossible for the American military fleet to move freely in the Strait of Hormuz.
Got it. Understood. The threat is from under the water. Okay, Dania, look, if the United States cannot get a deal in Islamabad that completely opens the Strait of Hormuz without it becoming a tollway, what would be the impact on U.S. Gulf relations?
This is an important question, and I think this is a red line for the Gulf states, because when this war started, the Strait of Hormuz was not an issue. And, the main issue was Iran's ballistic missiles, its nuclear program, and its proxy connections throughout the region. And now you've added something that is effectively making Iran the policeman and using the Strait of Hormuz as a vehicle of extortion against the Gulf states and their economies. This is extremely dangerous for many of the Gulf states. It's very bad for the UAE as a trading hub in the region, for Kuwait with its high degree of oil resources, and for Qatar, especially for its gas transport. And Bahrain is also locked in. So this is very dangerous for the Gulf states in terms of products coming in, and also for the international community, because you have 1/3 of the world's helium, which is really important for microchips coming out of the Gulf. You have fertilizer, which is important for food security globally. And on top of that, hydrocarbon resources that are the lifeline to Gulf economies. So in terms of the U.S., I think this would be a huge disappointment from the perspective of the Gulf states, and I think would make them reconfigure and recalculate in some way their relationship with the U.S. We haven't gotten to that point yet. I think this is a big factor of consideration from the Gulf states' perspective, though. Yeah, and it's hard to overlook.
Yeah, that would certainly be significant. And it's also noteworthy that, look, obviously the United States is the most powerful, ostensibly military in the world, and you have a lesser power that's able to effectively shut down this strait. And so, Maria, look, when it comes to military power and what is actually possible, do you think that there is a realization, and do you think that these two sides are in Islamabad talking right now because they've both realized that there are limits to what you can achieve militarily?
I think the problem here is this, that the military domain has brought in something which we had talked about in books, but Iran has actually displayed it. That is the use of asymmetric warfare against military and high military platforms. And that is something, just to put it in perspective, like $588 million was spent by the United States and the Gulf countries just to intercept the missiles. And in comparison to that, Iranians have spent less than 15 million. And, there's different statistics with regards to that. So this ratio is actually 60-1. So when you are fighting against an adversary's military tactics, which puts a strain on you around 60%, and while you're still fighting defensive, offensive war, where majority of your allies are fighting a defensive war and you're the only one going for offensive strikes, then you're the one who get hit once the corresponding action comes in. And that is what has actually happened in this 40-day war. Now, in comparison to that, Iran has taken 13,000 plus hits from the United States and Israel. And even then, we need to understand that wars do not end because, militarily one side wins and the other loses. It always depends upon the cost of war and also the resolve of the people to fight it through. And what we had seen was the resolve was there for the United States, and also the resolve was there for Iran. But the realization is that the next phase of war could be devastating, and that is why they're in Islamabad, and that is why they understand that it is better to negotiate with each other, because at the end of the day, they will be the ones picking up the biggest cost of war.
Yeah, and of course, the war is not just taking place in Iran, or had not just been taking place in Iran, but also in Lebanon, which is also a big sticking point of these negotiations. And Dania, you're American, you live in the United States. Can you help us understand why the U.S. is going to bat for a war that is not its war? The United States is not dropping bombs on Lebanon. Israel is. Why are they so insistent on letting the Israelis continue that, even if it's to a lesser extent?
Well, I think the U.S.'s long-standing policy has been to try to empower the Lebanese armed forces and the sovereignty of Lebanon actually over Hezbollah, where Israel has actually, and this is a divergence between Israel and the U.S., Israel has actually tried to disempower Hezbollah through military means. Therefore, I think they're in disagreement about Lebanon to a certain degree. It doesn't mean that the U.S. is necessarily reining in Israel, but I know that, for example, in the current circumstance, the U.S. has reined in Israel and told Israel to pull down the tempo a little bit when it came to attacking Hezbollah, and Israel followed suit. So I don't think they're actually seeing eye to eye. I think where they see eye to eye is both of them see Hezbollah as an enemy, per se. Obviously, more so from the Israeli perspective, but they have a different way of trying to address it.
Yeah. All right. We've got to leave it there. Dania Dhafar and Maria Sultan, we appreciate the expertise from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the two-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran has led to optimism about the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, but traffic remains at a fraction of normal levels, and hundreds of ships remain stranded. Kulsum Sharif explains.
Before the war, more than 100 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's more than 36,000 tankers a year. Now, 20% of global oil and natural gas pass through this critical waterway. But Iran's effective closure of it has stranded hundreds of oil tankers and other ships in the Gulf. Now, this is what we can see since Tuesday, the day of the ceasefire. And this image is from marinetraffic.com that lets us track vessel movements in real time. And what we see here is very little movement around the bend, but we see many ships that are stranded on either side. Now, before the truce was announced, US President Donald Trump had said reopening the strait was a requirement for any deal. Now, Tehran, for its part, says the passage of ships needs to be coordinated with its military. Now, the state news agency has released this map from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. It basically outlines a new route for ships to take. To simplify, I have this image here. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard are basically saying that ships need to sail through Iranian waters right around Larak Island and pass out this way and avoid the earlier normal path for the risk of naval mines. So the new path is effectively this way. Tehran has also indicated under a new permanent deal, they would seek to charge a fee for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Tehran's effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz since the start of the war has continued to roil energy markets, and supplies have further been hit with attacks on energy infrastructure right across the region, from Saudi Arabia, the world's largest crude oil exporter, to Qatar, a global leading LNG exporter.
All right, joining me in the studio is Alexander Hudistanu. He's a military defense analyst. Alexander, thank you for being here. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz here. The Americans say that 2 warships transited the strait. The Iranians are denying this. Do you agree with our previous guest, Maria Sultan, that essentially the Iranians would have to allow the Americans to pass because they wouldn't be able to otherwise? Do you agree with that assessment?
So there is not an effective blockade installed there, so ships can pass, but yes, they will have to be allowed more or less or not under attack when that happens. This is why I came to call this the curious case of Schrodinger's Strait. It's open and closed at the same time, and it just depends on who is actually asking to pass through the strait. So for some vessels, the strait is open. For some vessels, the strait is absolutely closed, and it's a duality that it's in the hands of Iran so far. There are military options to force open it, but the risk is too great, and nobody will assume that cost.
The U.S. president has been sending messages on his Truth Social platform today, insisting that Iran's military, including their entire Navy and Air Force, are completely destroyed. I mean, do you agree with that assessment? Is completely destroyed the adjectives that you would use?
It's hard to tell the level of destruction obtained by U.S. and Israel strikes during this 40 days war. For sure, there are still threats that Iran can pose. For sure, there are still vectors there that can be mines, drones, surface drone or aerial drones, that is, and small boats, fast boats that can still be used to threaten the traffic. That's why we don't really see a resurgence of traffic passing through the Strait since the ceasefire. We have seen a more diverse range of vessels passing in terms of types and flags, but are still the same, more or less, owners that were allowed to pass previously. But again, a bit more diversity, but still not open, commercially open.
I just want to briefly ask you about Lebanon, if I can. Obviously, this is becoming a sticking point in these negotiations with Iran. Based on what you have seen in Lebanon, the pattern of bombing, the boots on the ground, where they've been, what do you think the Israeli endgame is here in Lebanon? Are they trying to actually hold territory or just make a dent in Hezbollah's ability to strike them?
It's hard to say at this point, but we have seen Israel pushing always for this idea of having more buffer zones, more buffer space around. So it might be on that line of thought. And also that's why we might see this fragmentation of the war front. We have Iran and US engaged in negotiation, but at the same time, Israel says Lebanon is not part of this ceasefire. We are still gonna bomb Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, and we'll have direct negotiations with Lebanon government. So it feels like a strategic separation of this track in the military area, and it might have to do with this buffer zone mentality.
All right, Alexandru Hudishtana, we appreciate the expertise. Thank you.
Thank you also.
Well, Israeli airstrikes have intensified across southern Lebanon, with at least 10 people reported killed. Residential areas in the Nabatea district have been hit as attacks spread across several towns. Health officials say homes, infrastructure, and civilian facilities have been heavily damaged. Rescue teams are continuing to assess the damage and search affected areas. Well, demonstrators have gathered in Beirut to protest the government's decision to hold talks with Israel. But Hezbollah says it is against this particular demonstration. Malcolm Webb was there and has this report.
Soldiers and police deployed heavily in central Beirut following calls on social media for the demonstration. Police have surrounded it. A crowd of hundreds have gathered. Some are waving flags for Hezbollah, others for other political parties. Some people here have been cheering against the Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, who's called for Hezbollah to disarm in Beirut. There's a lot of discontent here with the government for agreeing to engage in direct talks with Israel. Many people feel that the government's in a very weak position to do this. Hezbollah's position is that Israel must not only cease fire, but withdraw from southern Lebanon. And in the past, it's only agreed to dialogue through an intermediary. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Beirut, Lebanon.
A temporary ceasefire has come into effect between Russia and Ukraine to coincide with the Orthodox Easter holiday. The two countries agreed to pause hostilities for 32 hours. They've said if either side violates the truce, the other would respond immediately. U.S.-led talks aimed at ending the four-year conflict have stalled in recent weeks. Well, despite tensions over the truce, the two sides each exchanged more than 175 prisoners of war on Saturday. The United Arab Emirates helped mediate the deal. Prisoner swaps are one of the few areas of cooperation between the warring sides. Well, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his rival Peter Maia are holding their final rallies before Sunday's parliamentary election. The vote is seen as a major challenge to the right-wing Orban. He's been in power for 16 years. On Friday, 100,000 people gathered for a concert in Budapest. The event doubled as a call for people to vote out the government. Orban's declining popularity follows economic stagnation, as well as political and corruption scandals. Susanna Wieg is a political analyst and associate researcher for Hungary at the European Council of Foreign Relations. She says the rise of Peter Maia in the polls reflects the electorate's biggest concerns.
What he managed to tap into, apart from the political frustration with the erosion of democracy, is also a growing disillusionment with Fidesz because of the economic hardships that the current government couldn't tackle over the past 4 or 5 years. The Hungarian economy has been stagnating since the COVID pandemic. There has been high inflation, and Péter Magyar could very much connect this lack of progress with the massive corruption of the governing party. And in doing so, he also talked to the biggest concerns of the current electorate. That was at some scale missing in the previous opposition parties.
Our coverage of the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran continues after Inside Story. Thanks for watching.
Shops here once stayed open until 9 or 10 at night. Now they must close at 8 under a nighttime curfew. Authorities say the curfew discourages unauthorized vendors, but some traders, including Najat Mistawi, say it's unfair.
There are illegal vendors everywhere because the council fails to manage them. The council thinks if we force the shops to shut, the vendors will go. But when I close at night, they're still there.
While some shopkeepers here are unhappy with the curfew, some residents say that they welcome it. They say they're fed up with the illegal street traders, the noise and the rubbish.
It's messy, it's dirty, it's sometimes you feel insecure.
300 shopkeepers are now challenging the curfew in court. A judge will have to decide how to protect the rights of residents and shopkeepers without shutting out one of the communities that's long shaped the neighborhood's identity.
A negative political and public reaction in Israel to the ceasefire with Iran, regardless of the respite it brings. No pause for Israel's army, however, or its victims. Hundreds killed in Lebanon and more dead in Gaza. Has Israeli society become conditioned to permanent war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. Ceasefires usually bring relief and celebration, but not in Israel, it seems, as hostilities with Iran have been paused for talks. Reports suggest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was pressured into the truce by US President Donald Trump. Since then, Netanyahu's faced the wrath of opposition politicians and a negative reaction in opinion polls. But war has not stopped. This week, Israeli attacks killed hundreds across Lebanon. In Gaza, the killing continues. War has been ever present since Israel's foundation. So what does a constant war footing mean for Israeli society? Has it become one virtually at permanent war? And what's that mean for its future direction and the region? We'll discuss this with our guest shortly. But first, this report from Imran Ullah Khan.
Even after the U.S. announced a 2-week ceasefire with Iran on Tuesday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel's attacks could resume at any point.
We have more goals to complete, and we will achieve them either by an agreement or by renewing the fighting. We are prepared to return to fighting at any moment necessary. Our finger is on the trigger.
But with the war garnering high levels of support in Israel, the opposition has framed the truce as a major setback for Netanyahu.
The people of Israel showed national resilience and determination. We inflicted serious damage on Iran. Precisely because of that, the total failure stands out even more. What happened here is a diplomatic disaster on a scale I do not recall.
The first opinion poll in Israel after the ceasefire with Iran showed 63% dissatisfied with the results of the war.
Well, nobody likes wars, but I don't know if it's really a ceasefire, because, I don't know, they bombed us, civilians, we bombed them, mostly military, and now what? There's no end game.
What has actually been achieved in this war so far? Aside from weakening and delaying the production of missiles or nuclear weapons, nothing has yet been achieved.
The pause in Israeli strikes on Iran has come with an escalation on another front. On Wednesday, within a 10-minute span, the Israeli military launched 100 strikes across Lebanon. They hit dozens of targets, including in the capital Beirut. causing mass civilian casualties. Israel maintains it was targeting Hezbollah sites. Since its founding nearly 80 years ago, Israel has been in a state of near perpetual war, not just in Lebanon and Iran. It's attacked countries across the region, including Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. But its military force has most often targeted occupied Palestine. In October 2023, those attacks escalated into a genocidal war on the Gaza Strip. More than 72,000 people were killed, and civilian infrastructure was decimated. 90% of the population, or around 1.9 million people, have been displaced from their homes, many of which have been destroyed. Destruction and devastation, the signature of Israel's presence. Imran Allah Khan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest now. In Exeter in the UK is Ilan Pape, a historian and professor at Exeter University. In Tel Aviv is Gideon Levy, a columnist at Haaretz newspaper. And in London is Chaim Brashith, a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. Thanks so much for being with us here on Inside Story today. We really do appreciate it. Professor Brashith, if I can begin with you. We've seen Israeli opposition politicians describe the Iran ceasefire as a disaster. We know the government, led by Netanyahu, is deeply opposed to it as well. In most countries, the end of a war brings some sort of relief, no matter how fragile. Why in Israel does it appear to apparently bring on a crisis?
Well, this is not an end to the war by a long chalk, and people understand this. This is not even a ceasefire at the moment, because Israel is firing at Lebanon. And if President Trump is unable or unwilling to stop this, that reflects a weakness which he doesn't like. So I think many people in Israel now believe that Netanyahu has brought them into a situation which is impossible. They're facing the brink. They are at the cliff edge, because not only is Netanyahu attacked by the opposition in Israel, he's now increasingly attacked by American politicians. And the American public, as opposed to the Israeli public, is totally opposed to the war. The Americans oppose the war in much higher percentages than the Israelis support it. The Israeli support has gone down from about 85 to 62%, and it will continue to go down, because people understand, as we heard in the clip, that nothing was achieved. And this war had only delivered a war forever for Netanyahu that needs this in order to stay in power. So I think both in America and in Israel, growing opposition to Netanyahu is likely to put him into an impossible position. People understand that if this is not done in the interest of Israelis or Americans or anybody else, and they will blame Trump for being led by Netanyahu into an impossible position, in which this is the first defeat that the Americans have suffered since the war in Vietnam. It's not going to make anyone happy in the United States. And as they turn the fire on Trump, he will deflect it onto Netanyahu. I think that is quite clear.
OK, we'll obviously wait to see how it all plays out. Gideon Levy, you've previously said that there are North Korean levels of support for the war. Is there a genuine, deeply held public consent for this ongoing permanent state of conflict? Do people actually want it, or are they simply too afraid to speak out against it?
We had today in Haaretz an excellent piece claiming that Israel and Israelis are addicted to war. And this might be a good explanation. I don't think that people are happy about war, but Israelis perceive wars as an opportunity in many cases. War in Gaza was an opportunity for the settlers. This was an opportunity to get rid of the regime in Iran, no matter how achievable it is, but it is an opportunity. Other people see it as an earthquake, as a force majeure, which, you can't do much about it. There are in certain places around the globe, earthquakes or other volcano explosions once in few years. Israel possesses wars once in few years, and people almost normalized it and think that's the way it should be. While none of those assumptions is right. Those are wars of choice in which in most of them Israel chose them, and in most of them Israel didn't gain anything by the end of them, but something brings Israelis again and again to support wars with much bigger majority and enthusiasm, rather than if you try to suggest diplomatic process, compromise, God forbid, the peace agreement, then you will find the majority shrinks into a minority.
I guess that's what we're trying to get here, is to try and figure out why. Why, like you say, Gideon, Israelis are addicted to war. Professor Pape, do you agree with that sentiment? And can you, I guess, try and explain that for people that might not really understand that in any way?
Yes, well, I think Gideon gave quite a very good analysis for it. It's a jingoistic society. And jingoistic societies, first of all, get excited by war. It creates a false sense of unity in a society which is not very united and diversified. It creates a detraction and a deflection for politicians and sections of society from other problems. So part of it is even mass psychology that we have encountered in the past in societies such as in Prussia and later in Germany and Italy, and to a certain extent in Britain, in certain periods of Britain's history. So this is something that we are familiar with. It's not unique to Israel. What is unique in a sense is that among the people who should provide a more profound analysis, whether it's a journalist, of course, Gideon is not the example for that, whether it's journalists, academics, people who should provide a more profound analysis, you hardly hear the connection between the ideology of the state, the history, the historical context, and the continued violence that Israelis find themselves again and again in one cycle after the other. So I don't think that there is any internal dynamics that would bring a change in this Israeli attitude. People in Israel would complain that the war was not successful, but when the opposition leader says the war was not successful, it doesn't mean he was against the war. He thought that he would have managed the war better. And this is something Netanyahu can capitalize on. He has enough time until the elections to make it seem that eventually the narrative, and he will try to control the narrative, that all in all, as Gideon said, it's force majeure and we did all we could, and it's much better to have me as a captain of the ship than anyone else.
Professor Brashith, is Israel becoming more extreme over the last decade or so? Because is there any real willingness within society to try and find an end to these conflicts, to try and find some sort of lasting peace for Israel?
I don't think that's even on the cards. You're right. Israel is becoming more extreme because others allow it to do so. The arrival of Trump in the White House is a great opportunity for Netanyahu, and he grasped it immediately, because before that, when he tried for a war with Iran, with other U.S. presidents, he failed. The biggest failure was with Obama, of course, who crafted an agreement designed to stop Israel from pushing for a war. But of course, immediately after Obama has left his position, Trump has given Israel a hope, and his second period in the White House was understood by Netanyahu as the window of opportunity, and he started immediately using it. So this is why it was Israel has become much more extreme than before, since the beginning of the second period of Trump, because it's possible to do things that were not possible before. And he used it very, very well. I mean, I don't think Trump would have gone to war with Iran before Netanyahu has made it a reality for him. Netanyahu and David Barnea, the head of Mossad, have sold him the war as a 4-day exercise that will include a regime change. Now look at it. Iran is controlling the Straits, which it didn't militarily before. It's controlling the in and out. It has destroyed all the bases of the United States in Arabia and the GCC. It's quite clear that neither Israel nor the United States have achieved their objectives, and yet, as Netanyahu said, he has created a new Sparta. Israel is the new Sparta, and it is now in the hands of the most extreme government, and the people of Israel are supporting the wars that this government is initiating. So yes, It is a very extreme society.
Gideon, just on that point, does the level of military force that we have seen recently from Israel actually even end threats, whether it's against Iran, Hamas, or Hezbollah? Has there been any sort of realization that they can't be eliminated outright, because we have not seen that in any of those circumstances, and that it's really inevitable that it's just going to lead to this forever type of war?
Yeah, unfortunately it is so. Look, Tom, around the Middle East, there are right now 6 million uprooted people who lost their homes, part of them forever, wandering from here to there as refugees, living in tents. 2 million in Gaza, 1 million in Lebanon, 3 million in Tehran. Israeli thinks that this is normal, that this is an inevitable outcome of this war, of any war. In the same time, Israelis normalize this reality of running and rushing to the shelters, even for themselves, as something normal. And then comes this support that we mentioned before, and all this together creates a profile of sickness. I have no other word to describe it. Sickness. Getting used to wars, getting addicted to wars, getting this belief that they are inevitable, and getting this belief, which is a long time in Israel's cycle, that Israel has the right to do whatever it wants and it can live on its sword forever. So all those beliefs together create a very problematic, to say the least, very problematic profile of Israel, profile of the Israeli society right now. Should worry any Israeli.
Professor Pape, Israel is a society where we've almost every, or the vast majority of every adult has actually served in the military. In Gaza, we've seen Israeli soldiers take to social media and post all sorts of horrendous acts, basically showing off their exploits, they're bragging almost about the destruction that they've caused there. Does that show the kind of status and currency the Israeli military has in Israeli society?
Well, Tom, I think this is it's a long-term feature of the Israeli society, elite and society at large, of their perceptions of the Palestinians and their attitude towards the Palestinians. In one word, you can call it dehumanization. The very idea that you can dehumanize the Palestinians would lead later on to the symptoms that you're talking about, not being worried about showing the kind of atrocities that are being committed and even brag about them. So I do think we have to take it into account that this is part of what settler colonial projects like Israel and Zionism look like when you examine them and their attitude towards the indigenous local population. You cannot massively expel half of Palestine's population in 1948 if you don't dehumanize it first in your own mindset. And similarly, you cannot impose on the Palestinians the kind of repertoire of war crimes and now also crimes against humanity unless you dehumanize them. So I do think that from an Israeli perspective, media, culture, society, this is not something that they are worrying about. There's no moral inhibition, and it is accepted, as Gideon also said, as something that is normal, not only normal in the sense that they have to be in a constant and perpetual cycle of violence against the indigenous people and those who support them, but that in the fight against them, which from an Israeli perspective would be an existential fight, you are fighting people who are savages, people who are anti-Semites. The reference changes with time, but the basic idea is that you are facing the worst kind of people, and therefore you are entitled to use every method at your disposal. I'm generalizing here. Fortunately, not every Israeli Jew thinks like that. Not every Israeli Jewish politician thinks like that, but the vast majority who go through the Israeli educational system, through the socialization that comes through the army and the media, have this kind of perception of the Palestinians. And therefore, there was this kind of support for the genocide, and therefore there is no empathy whatsoever for the million Lebanese that were displaced or the 3 million Iranians who were displaced. On the contrary, the push for the government is to continue with these policies. And again, we have to come back to that point. The criticism in Israel is not about the war, but about the performance in the war.
Yeah, the way it's being done.
That it was about the war itself, but it's not about the war.
Right.
It's about the way it was executed.
Indeed. Professor Brishit, just staying with the power of the media, we heard there almost saying that people have been indoctrinated or maybe even brainwashed over decades. Is that how you see it? Has it gone that far, do you think?
Well, I think that a group of people, a nation, which practices genocide for 2.5 years without a break and without a thought about what it means, is actually now in collective dissonance. They are actually harmed to a degree that they don't even see reality. Some of the material that you showed showed the glee with which they bomb universities, bomb hospitals, and send them as a kind of happy anniversary to their wife or happy birthday to their daughter, etc. This has happened in thousands of cases, but the people who see those clips are not just the wife or the daughter, but the rest of humanity. So they have lost any human reactions to disaster, even to disaster that they are causing themselves. And the use of media, which was not available in other generations, but now it is. Every sadist blowing up a hospital can share it with the rest of humanity. So while Israelis are coarsened by this experience and become immune to it, the rest of humanity is now seeing Israel for what it is for the first time. So after 2.5 years of this experience of destroying tens of thousands, maybe now hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, what do few thousand people mean in Iran or in Syria or in Lebanon, etc.? They don't mean anything. This is just more dead people. So Israel has turned into a chaos engine of the West. It is sowing death and destruction everywhere it goes, and is proud of it. This is very sick, as Gideon pointed out.
A chaos engine of the West. Gideon, can Israel change? Can Israeli society change? Is there a version of the country that could, at some point, actually choose peace? And what will it actually take to get there?
Absolutely, Tom. Israel can change, and unfortunately, it seems that it will change, but for the better. All the signs show that the younger generation is much more nationalistic, racist, ignorant in many cases, violent, militaristic. You see it in the polls. Also religious. Don't forget that demography is also playing a role in Israel, and the ultra-Orthodox and the national religious, the settlers, are growing in figures that the secular will become a minority in this country within very few years. And then the change will be obvious. It cannot be a positive change when this is the demography. Now, what we also lack is an alternative. I mean, Israelis, young and old, don't see any alternative. Because we have Netanyahu, who is the most hated and the most beloved politician ever in Israel. And then there is the so-called opposition, which basically doesn't offer any alternative. They are in favor of the war, in favor of the occupation, in favor of the genocide, in favor of the transfer, in favor of the apartheid. So what kind of an alternative? For change, you need, first of all, some kind of leadership.
Okay.
Right now in Israel, there is no leadership for positive change, by all means not.
Professor Pape, are you as pessimistic as Gideon is about the near future of Israel? And what, if anything, could potentially break that cycle?
I'm pessimistic about the near future. I'm not pessimistic about the long-term future, but not because I think there will be a change from within Israel. But I think that, as Chaim pointed out, the world is watching. Now, it's true that the political elites of the world are watching and are indifferent, in some cases are even complicit in what's happening, but not their societies. And the elites we have today are not necessarily the elites we will have tomorrow, either in the region or in the world. So I think in the long term, this project, especially in its present shape, is not sustainable, and it will collapse. The question is, how will it collapse? Will it be a decolonization and liberation that is violent? Is it possible to make it less violent process of change, a regime change? All of this are something that we cannot know, but we definitely understand that the collapse is on its way. The big question is, does it create a void that would be immediately filled by the Palestinian liberation movement? Will the region and the world be constructive in their involvement in that process? But I'm not talking about the next 2 or 3 years. I'm afraid that Gideon and Chaim are correct about the next 2 or 3 years. But strategically speaking, and historically speaking, from every other precedent that we know, this kind of behavior, this kind of society, this kind of rogue states are not sustainable in the long run.
Thank you so much, all three of you. We really do appreciate your time. Your insight is so invaluable to us here on Inside Story, as well as all of our viewers watching around the world. Thank you, Professor Pape, Gideon Levy, and Professor Brashith, once again for being with us today. Well, thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, that is aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the entire team here, that's it for now. Al Jazeera's coverage from across the Middle East and around the world continues in just a moment.
The Iranian regime can never have nuclear weapons, and they need to stop sponsoring terrorism. The United States started this war, and the Zionist regime started it.
The Strait of Hormuz will be open.
The strait is currently open and is closed only to those who are at war with Iran.
Attack Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain. That is the range of these weapons.
We attack American facilities, American forces.
Get the full picture on Al Jazeera.
When the war is going to be over.
As soon as we achieve our objectives.
Hard-hitting interviews.
Aren't you afraid that you might be one of the targets?
Anyone could become a target. We have seen that they have no hesitation about targeting any place.
Facing realities.
Does Qatar still trust Iran enough to mediate?
Let's say that this aggression brings a benefit for no one.
Thought-provoking answers.
How many have been displaced inside Iran?
I've heard 3 million. It could be more.
Hear their story on Talk to Al Jazeera.
Opening up the conversation.
Humor basically packages things in a way that is more digestible for the people that aren't interested or resist the political conversation.
Connecting communities.
And these really are incredibly intelligent young men and women who deserve the opportunities that they have earned.
With fresh perspectives from lesser heard voices.
But the primary thing that we can do is actually get off US technology.
The stream explores the key issues of our times on Al Jazeera.
The world's top business stories.
How high could prices go for oil? Also, how quickly can this feed into the inflation picture?
Counting the cost on Al Jazeera.
Sami Zaidan. It's 1800 GMT. You're watching Al Jazeera's extensive coverage of the ceasefire in the war between the US, Israel and Iran. Face to face in Pakistan, negotiations between the US and Iran are underway. Technical talks extend into the night. The US's delegation's led by Vice President J.D. Vance, who said he's optimistic about the outcome of negotiations. More death, more destruction in southern Lebanon. Israel continues strikes despite an agreement for talks with Lebanon. And protests in the Lebanese capital against the government's decision to hold direct talks with Israel. Between the US, Iran and Pakistan are ongoing in Islamabad. Iranian state media reports that last efforts are being made to close any gaps. These are the highest level negotiations between Washington and Tehran since Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Tehran's delegation is led by Speaker of Parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Affairs Minister Abbas Araghchi. Ahead of the talks, they set preconditions, including the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets and an end to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. Well, US Vice President J.D. Vance and his team have met with the Iranian delegation. The US wants the Strait of Hormuz to be open for oil tankers and other vessels without limitation. Before the negotiations, Washington said it's open to significant sanctions relief, but only in exchange for Iranian concessions on nuclear development. These talks come after Israel and the US launched attacks on Iran 6 weeks ago. More than 3,000 Iranians have been killed and at least 26,500 people injured since the start of the war. Attacks have also struck multiple civilian facilities, including hospitals, universities, and schools. And the conflict has also widespread effects across the world. Well, to cover the latest on the negotiations between the US and Iran, Ali Hashim is live for us in the Iranian capital. But first, we're joined by our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. She's also live for us from Islamabad. And Kimberly, we saw J.D. Vance heading into those talks with something of a positive note. Has that positive note been sustained at this point? What are you hearing from US officials?
Well, what we have to do is sort of read the body language a lot of the time. And I can tell you that this trip in particular has been much more secretive in terms of leaks and what is going on than we've seen in the past. Now, if you can see off in the distance behind me, that is the Serena Hotel, the building there with the lights at the top. That is currently meeting. And as you can see, the lights are still on. That means they are working into the night. It's 11 p.m. local time here in Islamabad, and there is no sign that these parties are breaking up. What we know is that there had been some reporting the talks had concluded. What that was an end to a breakout session. The groups have had broken up with the Iranians and the United States and then Pakistan sort of facilitating all of this. They were exchanging notes back and forth, and then they realized they could get to a point where they could once again resume these face-to-face talks. We should point out some of the most significant in decades since 1979. But in terms of the tone, you're right. It was no accident that the United States decided to put J.D. Vance, the vice president, at the helm of that. And that is because of the concern not only that there has been a lot of bombastic language used in the past, and even today, we should point out, by the U.S. President Donald Trump in his Truth Social post, but the concern that there is a deficit of trust that needs to be closed in order to accomplish some of these big goals. Of course, you outlined them, not only reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but also the primary goal for the United States to ensure Iran never has a nuclear weapon.
Any sign, any indication, Kimberly, of progress, not only on those big issues you mentioned, but even on some of the, if we can call them initial issues, like unfreezing Iranian assets?
I didn't hear the start of your question, but I did get the tail end, and I'm just going to keep going. We've had some technical issues, and it's not surprising given the fact that we're so close to the delegation. So let me just press on and tell you, with regard, I did hear you ask about the preconditions, and what we know is that one of the big ones was to see the unfreezing of Iranian assets, and there has been reporting all night and into the day that that in fact was the case. But the White House has said that up to this point, nothing has been agreed to, and the negotiations are still ongoing. But we know this is something that Iran is looking for. And I can tell you the number 6 billion is a number that is floating around, but again, not confirmed. Now, the other issue that is, of course, of big importance to Iran is to see that the fighting in Lebanon stops, that Israel stops targeting southern Lebanon. And, of course, that is also something that is still being worked out, including looking ahead to Tuesday for discussions in Washington. So these are some of the big hurdles that need to be accomplished. But I can tell you what's happening right now in the hotel behind me is that they are working late into the night. The U.S. delegation is supported by a team of experts and subject matter experts, not just here in Islamabad, but also in Washington, so that they can continue to work in real time without any delay in getting facts, figures, numbers that may slow down any progress.
Let's thank Kimberly Halkett. Let's keep it going, though. Kimberly is in Tehran, in Islamabad, but let's keep it going now with Ali Hashimi. Joins us live from Tehran. And Ali, picking up on what Kimberly just mentioned there, what's the word from Iranian officials? They feel this was a productive day, at least on some of those issues, preliminary issues of assets and ceasefire in Lebanon.
Well, what we're hearing from the Iranian side is that, first of all, with respect to Lebanon, there is a kind of a consensus that the Israelis will stop targeting Beirut and the suburbs, and also with respect to the assets that they've been unfrozen. However, these are just coming from the Iranian side, and they're not coming even from officials directly, rather from sources to Iranian news outlets. On the other side, with respect to what's going on right now, it seems that there are issues that have been agreed upon, because we know even before the talks, there were papers going from here to there, and they're trying to put together a kind of a framework. But Now the Iranian officials are saying, or at least the sources are saying, that there are excessive demands. Given the fact they've met for now a couple of times and there's a possibility of a third time tonight, no, for now we don't know if this is going to be extended for another day. But the issue now should be resting in the hands of the experts. If there's a framework, then experts will have to meet all the week till probably next week. The officials will meet once again to take political decisions. We cannot till the moment say there is optimism or pessimism from here, from Tehran, but what we can say is that the process is going on and everyone is waiting to see how it's going to end.
And we'll be waiting to see how it ends as well, and no doubt you will be for us too. For now, let's thank Ali Hashim joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Now, as the progress in Islamabad, one of Iran's main demands is a ceasefire in Lebanon. Israeli attacks have killed at least 2,020 people since the fighting began in March. Israel and the United States say the ceasefire between Tehran and Washington does not include the campaign in Lebanon, but Iran insists it does. The latest Israeli strikes have killed at least 10 people in southern Lebanon. Residential areas in the Nabatea district have been hit. Attacks have spread across several towns, we're told. Health officials say homes, infrastructure, and civilian facilities, they've all been heavily damaged. And rescue teams, they're continuing to assess the damage and search affected areas. Southern Lebanon has been heavily affected by Israeli military operations in recent years. Newly verified satellite images show widespread destruction across several villages. Amnesty International says more than 10,000 structures were destroyed between October and January 2025. The group accuses Israel of targeting civilian sites, including schools and hospitals. Now, it says this could amount to war crimes. Abaida Hito joins us now live from Tyre in southern Lebanon, and continuing with disturbing reports, we're hearing now of Israeli occupation forces carrying out demolitions. Why, Abaida?
Yeah, the Israeli military carried out a huge demolition operation today in the town of Naqoura. 3 simultaneous explosions. The Israeli military says it's destroying tunnel systems, infrastructure used by the Hezbollah group, weapons caches, depots, homes that were used by the group that's allied with Iran here in Lebanon. But what we're seeing and what rights groups continue to confirm is that these areas are civilian neighborhoods, civilian towns, buildings that are homes, that are businesses. The amount of damage is actually very huge. The World Bank estimates that around $7 billion in damages to structures and infrastructure as a result of these demolition operations by Israel since 2023. The Amnesty International also says around 40,000 structures have been either fully damaged, fully destroyed, or partially damaged. Around 25% of the buildings in southern Lebanon have been damaged or affected in some way by this policy. Rights groups are calling it wide-scale and systematic. And what people understand here is that Israel is trying to make these areas unlivable so that people don't return. And even if they do return, they won't have homes to come back to. They won't have businesses or communities to return to. And this is a threat that we heard from the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, on many occasions, especially in recent history, just before the ceasefire came into play with Iran. Israel Katz confirmed that Israel's policy, Israel's intention is to create a buffer zone where Lebanese people are unable to return to. This is going to have a huge impact on Lebanese society, on communities that are now possibly permanently displaced for a long time and won't be able to return to their homes, especially with jets and drones continuing to carry out strikes throughout southern Lebanon. Things are not looking good for those people who have been permanently displaced from their homes and possibly for much longer.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Obaida Hito, reporting to us from Tyre in southern Lebanon. Another major discussion point in the Pakistan-sponsored talks is Iran's demands on the US. Tehran wants frozen assets to be released and the lifting of economic sanctions. Washington has indicated that it's open to significantly easing sanctions, but only in exchange for concessions from Tehran regarding its nuclear and missile programs. In 1979, the US imposed sanctions in response to the seizure of the US embassy and its staff in the Iranian capital. They continued because of Tehran's support for armed groups and its nuclear ambitions. Iran wants to regain access to funds held in major global banks, estimated to be worth more than $100 billion. They could help its struggling economy. Nearly half of Iranians live below the poverty line. Since 2025, its economy has struggled with a sharp currency collapse and surging inflation. In D.C. is Gordon Gray. He's a former U.S. ambassador and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. And here in the studio, Danya Dhafar. Danya Dhafar, I should say. She's the Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Good to have you in. Danya, first of all, how do you see this so far? So far, so good?
Well, I think the fact that you have very senior figures from Iran and the U.S. there is a good indicator that they're serious about negotiations. You can possibly be cautiously optimistic, but there's still a huge gap between what each party is asking. And then also I wonder, since Israel is not at the table and it's one of the warring parties, what does that mean in terms of tensions in the region? But overall, it seems like so far they are in goodwill in regards to negotiations. But there's still a lot of concern because the Strait of Hormuz is still not open. And,
Still a lot of work to be done, clearly. Let me bring in Ambassador Gray. Do we have any indication on whether the two sides are making any progress, inching any closer towards each other, especially on some of the key issues like uranium enrichment?
Well, I don't think it's realistic to expect progress on major issues such as enrichment or any other major issue on the first day of talks. I think what is promising is the fact that the Iranian delegation is composed of very senior leaders. That clearly indicates the Iranian interest in serious negotiations. The same can be true of the U.S. side, since it's headed by Vice President Vance. Also, the fact that the talks apparently went on for quite a long time shows, at a minimum, there was engagement on the issues. But, remember how long it took for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to be negotiated. It wasn't negotiated in a day, a week, a month, 60 days. It took years of discussions and back and forth. So these discussions are not going to end today or tomorrow.
Danya, they have brought with them this time committees, teams of experts, people who are familiar with some of the details of military, economic, security, political issues, right? This is quite a series of delegations showing up. Does this mean, I'm not sure it will collapse the years, which Ambassador Gray is saying, but does this mean they can work on a quicker timeline than previously?
It's very difficult to say because I think there are so many things being negotiated now. Issues that were negotiated when the JCPOA was focused on, plus many other issues. Right now, they're talking about the Strait of Hormuz, which is an additional problem, and also disarmament of Iran from a nuclear perspective, which was what the JCPOA was focused on, but also their ballistic missiles program and their proxy relations in the region. And it just seems like 2 weeks is very ambitious for that to be resolved for sure.
Ambassador Gray, what are we looking at least at this stage? Is this a ceasefire negotiation, or are we pretty confident it started right off the bat into talks on a more comprehensive settlement of all issues between the US and Iran?
My guess is that each side gave an opening statement in which they outlined what their positions were. Those positions, like in most negotiations, were probably maximalist rather than where the two sides will end up when there's an agreement. If I were conducting the negotiations, and I'm glad to say I'm not, but if I were, I'd try and break down the issues into smaller ones. From the United States perspective, the interest because of the domestic pressures on the Trump administration is going to be reopening the Strait of Hormuz. For the Iranian delegation, I think the immediate issue is going to be some sort of sanctions relief because of the poor state their economy's been in even before the devastating attacks they've suffered. And then I would move from those, hopefully building confidence in the negotiation through the negotiations to the larger issues such as nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment, Iranian support for proxies, et cetera, et cetera.
Dania, is it a given at this point that we're going to go into days of talks in Islamabad?
Indeed, I think if this negotiation is successful, I think more than days, and I've even seen...
With some of the top-level people, from J.D. Vance to Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf, I mean, how long can we expect that level of people to be present?
I would expect they would probably be there for days because this is both critically important for both countries. Now, I still am not optimistic that this can be resolved within days, and I've seen that there has been discussions about prolonging the ceasefire to a 30-day ceasefire, which Iran has pushed back against and saying that they want a final end to the war.
They want a complete end to this, not rather than a ceasefire.
Yes.
Does Ambassador Gray, does Iran have more leverage this time round compared to earlier rounds of talks because, A, the US has gone to war, it has failed to achieve what Donald Trump said on March the 6th he wanted to achieve, unconditional surrender, and B, because in this round of talks, it's got its hands firmly around the neck of the Straits of Hormuz?
The short answer to your question is yes, for both the reasons you said. The president never laid out the case to the American public as to why this war was important. He missed the opportunity to do so just 4 days before he launched the war, February 24th, when he gave the State of the Union address. He really only talked about Iran in passing rather than explaining exactly why it was necessary in his mind to go to war. I would contrast that to President Bush 43 in the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, or President Bush 41 in the run-up to Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and the liberation of Kuwait. So the war is unpopular. There's pressure on the Trump administration, and there's obviously pressure on the Iranian regime as well. But I think, as you point out, with their control over the Strait of Hormuz, they've got a lot more leverage than they've had in previous negotiations with the United States.
And Dania, what about Gulf concerns? They've borne a big chunk of missile and drone attacks, right? How much of a say are they getting on the table right now?
Well, that's a good question. There are informal Gulf delegations there from Saudi and Qatar. So I'm pretty sure they're eyeing GCC interests there. I think one of their core frustrations with the deal that happened before, the JCPOA in 2015, was the fact that they were not included in the deal, and their considerations were not concluded. So I think they've been very vocal about not having deals made without them being included. What they're looking for is a security guarantee for not being attacked. They're also looking for reparations, and I think they will try to achieve that through. Also, I think, you know, the fact that Iran is holding the Strait of Hormuz is a big consideration for the Gulf states. And the fact that it even insinuated it would make it like a toll booth is interesting, because they say they want to raise money for all of the damages from the war to rebuild Iran. But I also think they might use that as leverage from the Gulf states to try to get them to help them rebuild Iran as well.
From the war damage, right. We're going to have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests, Ambassador Gordon Gray, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Danya Dhafar here in the studio, Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum. That's a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Well, as ceasefire talks in Islamabad continue, Donald Trump is vowing to maintain U.S. military presence in the Middle East until a deal is reached, and he's warning of a major escalation in fighting if Iran refuses to comply. Tehran is pushing for the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the region, a halt to the war on all fronts, and firm non-aggression commitments. Well, joining us from Islamabad is Maria Sultan. She is the chairperson and president of the South Asian Strategic Stability Institute University and an advisor to the Ministry of Defense and Strategic Military Affairs. Good to have you with us. So, first of all, I was reading a statement from the U.S. military talking about how they have begun, I think the exact words were that they have begun operations to try and open up, or they're setting the conditions for operations in the Straits of Hormuz. Do we know what that means exactly?
Well, I don't know what that means, but one thing is for sure, militarily, it's not possible for them to actually outmaneuver Iran's deterrence policy, which is built around asymmetric disruption, because the United States military, for its latter part of its military experience, has been trained against coin operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. The Gulf military story isn't that helpful either, because there is a lot of military readiness issue, there's a supply chain disruption issue, there is also the bigger issue of whether these bases, these 7 bases which the United States had in the Gulf, they have remained intact, or are they actually capable of sustaining a long-term war? And then the bigger question is that how will they actually outmaneuver this in a very narrow strait of almost 21 miles, where there's almost absolute dominance, which the Iranian underwater and as well as coastal defense and also UAVs,
Maria, touching on your point of the situation with U.S. bases, to what extent has this impacted the long-term presence of the U.S. military forces in the region?
Mathematics are not good. The total number of United States forces in the Gulf is around 50,000. The combined capacity of the Gulf countries' forces is around 350,000. That is also to include the Saudi, component. Although the numbers are staggering when it comes to actually buying, all the fancy hardware, but there is an actual military readiness, capability gap. That means that they are not actually combat ready when it comes to fighting against an adversary, which is quite capable of fighting, beyond visual range, tactics, and also ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, electronic suppression, and drone warfare. United States has taken a hit. And that hit will also come in terms of how much military hardware is there. Actually all of, majority of the Gulf hardware is actually coming from U.S. defense industry, from Raytheon and Boeing. And if you just look at the statistics, just in terms of THAAD alone, it's around 108, THAAD systems which are there, in the Gulf. If you also take the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, then another additional 50 plus. But that means that per year you can only create, per month you can only create 2 interceptors, and that's at the cost of $4 million each. So this means in a year you can only produce 98 interceptors, and we all know that the 40-day war has taken a toll with regards to interceptors, with regards to an offensive capability.
We do indeed, Maria, and you said they've taken a hit. Is the hit unsustainable? Because here are some stats which I looked up. Let's look at Tomahawk missiles. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, now they're saying 6 days, just in 6 days, the first 6 days of the war, the US had used over 300 Tomahawk missiles. 300. They produce, I think the estimate is around 100 a year. The THAAD missiles you mentioned, according to the Payne Institute, in the first 2 weeks of the war, 16 days, 40% of the THAAD stockpile has been used. Again, they produce something like 98 a year. When you look at those kinds of, is that part of the pressure right now on the US to try and get a deal and try and end this to avoid stockpile depletion?
That is true, because the total amount of interceptors is around 500 in the Gulf and the combined region together, and 40% is only just first 16 days of the war. And if you include the rest, the mathematics just don't add up. Gulf is in no position, and neither is the U.S. presence in the Middle East in any position to actually fight, any long-duration war with Iran at this moment. If they will have to escalate, they will have to escalate from mainland United States, and that would mean a very different category of weaponry. That would mean a very different category of supply chain and a very different category of threat level anticipation. And even then,
Maria, let me jump in and be devil's advocate and say, what about the U.S. claim that they've degraded the Iranian ability to fight a war? Is that accurate? Do we have any stats?
Yeah, we do have some stats. According to the stats, the Iranians claim that they have 14,000 ballistic missiles and they have 45,000 drones. That is their official statistics, what they have said. And these are the declared ones. So if we include the DF-31s and if we include the naval capacity, which we have not seen and display at the moment, but if that comes forward and the fact that it can be very rapidly reproduced, we're talking about an infinite war, because it's the war cycle, it's the 3D printers, it is technology on a run. It cannot be competed with, not with the asymmetric warfare and also the lack of capability gap which exists on ground.
Okay, briefly, Maria, what's the bottom line of all of this? You've given us a lot of numbers and stats to think about. If these talks don't succeed, to what extent can the US afford to go back into war and a long-term war?
It's going to be very costly, strategically very different, and they will have to go for the main weapon systems which are based elsewhere. And that would mean they will have to rethink which region they will give up. East Asia, West Asia, or, the Caucasus, they will have to think it through. They can't be in multiple theaters and actually have the numbers to outmaneuver and outwin Iran in the current situation.
Good to get your thoughts and analysis on that. Maria Sultan joining us from Islamabad. She's the South Asian Strategic Civility Institute University and Military Affairs President and Chairperson. Sorry, it's a long title.
That's okay.
Well, the U.S. Central Command, also known as CENTCOM, says it has begun setting conditions for clearing mines in the Strait of Hormuz, with 2 U.S. Navy-guided missile destroyers conducting operations. Now, it's unclear if there are mines in the crucial waterway. Iran wants recognition of its authority over the strait as it aims to collect transit fees and control access. This would constitute a huge shift in the balance of power in the region. The United States says fully opening the Strait of Hormuz to oil tankers is a prerequisite, including unrestricted traffic without any fees. Joining me in the studio is Alexandru Budashtan, defense analyst. Good to have you with us. Perhaps it will be good just at the beginning to put into perspective why the Straits of Hormuz is such an important issue, not only for the US, but for the world. We're talking about 20% global seaborne trade of oil, 20% of LNG, and 33% of fertilizer, right? This is literally life and death stuff for economies.
It is life and death stuff for economies, and the issue is not just the numbers, the percentage, it's also the fact that there is not enough reserve supply in other parts to compensate these numbers. So there will be more and more competition on the market to reach those particular supplies. And we haven't yet mentioned plastics, and modern economies cannot function with that. We haven't discussed about helium, which is crucial for semiconductors and the high-tech technologies. Again, we are talking 30% or more produced in the region that doesn't reach the market right now. And there's no reserve supply you can just go and buy from.
So one understands the, shall we say, the eagerness of the U.S. Navy to get this opened up. They've mentioned, as I read out that statement, was talking about how Navy-guided missile destroyers conducted operations. What kind of operations? Is there coordination with the Iranian Navy?
I would not say there's coordination. The issue is that these discussions...
Because it's difficult to understand that they could just go in there.
Yeah. So
the Iranians are just backing down and looking the other way?
I don't think. I think the fact that the ceasefire is to be trusted, and so for the conversation, the negotiation in Islamabad to actually be trustworthy, there has to be some form of trust. Not attacking the two U.S. warships that passed through the strait today is just signaling that. At the same time, U.S. has passed two destroyers, which are not necessarily very apt ships at doing countermine operations. Maybe they have teams on board with some specific deployable equipments to do that, but these are guided missile destroyers. These are surface warfare or anti-air warfare.
Alexandra, are you saying this is basically a symbolic act?
I think it's a symbolic act from both sides. Iran is saying, okay, we're going to let this slide. We're not going to attack these two ships passing, because they could have attacked them. That doesn't mean they could have necessarily touched them or hit them, but they could have attacked them. Also, U.S. is saying we're going to sail these ships through the strait to show that the strait is probably not that mined, or at least not, the risk is not as big as it said, because mine warfare tends to be built on rumor also. You can just convey a rumor that is believed, and the effect is there already without the mines being in the water.
How much impact will this kind of operation, to use the CENTCOM term, will it ultimately have a significant impact on the willingness of shipping companies, on, shall we say, the stomach of insurance companies to say, oh, well, two ships have gone through, so it's fine?
Not necessarily. It takes time for merchant traffic to resume in this type of situation, and that time can be fairly lengthy. But at the same time, this is a closed space, water space. There's no other entry point in the Gulf rather than the Strait of Hormuz. Similarly, we can go to do a parallel with the Black Sea, and even under mine threats that happened there, the shipping still started picking up after sufficient understanding about the conditions regarding the security situation were understood by the companies that it's sufficient. So for this ceasefire to translate in the direct resume of shipping, some more time needs to pass, and less, let's say, damaging acts need to pass in the Gulf for the shipping companies to take the risk.
Alexandra, what's the bottom line here? If these talks don't go in the right direction, does the U.S. Navy really have some real options for leverage in terms of fully opening up the Straits of Hormuz? Because we've seen they've kept some key assets like aircraft carriers at some distance away, right?
Aircraft carriers tend to not operate in confined water, so I would not be surprised it will still stay out. I would be surprised if they will try to enter with the aircraft carrier in the Gulf. The bottom line is that they can do something about it, but it will be very costly in the sense of time, resource, risk undertaken in order to do this forcefully. Most likely the opening of the Hormuz will have to be something negotiated between the two parties, between the two parts, between Iran and US in that sense.
Okay, Alexander Hudashtanu, military defense analyst, thank you so much for coming in. And demonstrators have gathered in Beirut to protest the government's decision to hold talks with Israel. Hezbollah says it's against this particular demonstration. Malcolm Webb was there, has this report.
Soldiers and police deployed heavily in central Beirut following calls on social media for the demonstration. Police have surrounded it. A A crowd of hundreds have gathered. Some are waving flags for Hezbollah, others for other political parties. Some people here have been cheering against the Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, who's called for Hezbollah to disarm in Beirut. There's a lot of discontent here with the government for agreeing to engage in direct talks with Israel. Many people feel that the government's in a very weak position to do this. Hezbollah's position is that Israel must not only cease fire, but withdraw from southern Lebanon. And in the past, it's only agreed to dialogue through an intermediary. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Beirut, Lebanon.
The two-week ceasefire between the US and Iran has led to optimism about the Strait of Hormuz reopening perhaps soon. But traffic remains at a fraction of normal levels. See, hundreds of ships are still stranded there. Kulsum Sharif explains.
Before the war, more than 100 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's more than 36,000 tankers a year. Now, 20% of global oil and natural gas pass through this critical waterway. But Iran's effective closure of it has stranded hundreds of oil tankers and other ships in the Gulf. Now, this is what we can see since Tuesday, the day of the ceasefire. And this image is from marinetraffic.com that lets us track vessel movements in real time. And what we see here is very little movement around the bend, but we see many ships that are stranded on either side. Now, before the truce was announced, US President Donald Trump had said reopening the strait was a requirement for any deal. Now, Tehran, for its part, says the passage of ships needs to be coordinated with its military. Now, the state news agency has released this map from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. It basically outlines a new route for ships to take. To simplify, I have this image here. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard are basically saying that ships need to sail through Iranian waters right around Larak Island and pass out this way and avoid the earlier normal path for the risk of naval mines. So the new path is effectively this way. Tehran has also indicated under a new permanent deal, they would seek to charge a fee for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Tehran's effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz since the start of the war has continued to roil energy markets, and supplies have further been hit with attacks on energy infrastructure right across the region, from Saudi Arabia, the world's largest crude oil exporter, to Qatar, a global leading LNG exporter.
I'm joined now by Salman Sheikh. He's the founder of a peace-building organization called the Sheikh Group. He's also a former UN official. Good to have you with us. So the fact that we have the highest level talks between Iran and the US in decades, is that in itself a breakthrough, Salman?
Yes, it is. It's actually quite significant that you have an American delegation, which is not just Steve Witkoff, but he's backed up by other senior officials and experts who seem to be covering a broad range of subjects which need to be on the table. We know this is a complex negotiation. And on the Iranian side, too, this is a regime in reformation from the political side to the supreme leader to the security side. So again, I think we seem to have the right group of people at least to try and now set an agenda on how to go forward.
Your group focuses on peace building. Expectations might be quite high, but realistically speaking, peace building takes time, doesn't it?
Yes, it can take 10, 20 years, frankly speaking, for us to get to a stable situation. But for now, I think we're looking at it in terms of envelopes of 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, etc. So where are we right now? Well, it is, as you've been reporting, the Strait of Hormuz, and whether the ceasefire is solid enough, and if it extends to flashpoints such as Lebanon. That is one of the discussions that are certainly need to be resolved, as well as I've just said, clearly agreeing an agenda for how you take those difficult issues forward. Right now, from what I understand...
Is there an agreed agenda? That was one of the the issues that there's been a lot of back and forth on, right? You had Donald Trump's tweet a few days ago, or his post on social media, indicating Iran's 10-point proposal was something workable. But then we heard from Caroline Levitt just a few days later, indicating that Donald Trump had thrown the 10-point proposal in the garbage and they'd worked something else out. Do we know what the agenda is?
Well, the Americans are engaging on the 10 points, but you're right to raise this question of, do we actually know what the agenda is? And I would say that, at least from what I'm hearing, that is precisely what is now the crunch point in talks right now. I think they move back to some form of indirect facilitation and mediation between the Pakistanis and the two sides. And what they're trying to do is to find a rump agenda which they can all agree with. Interestingly, I think the Iranians will also need other guarantees regarding this agenda, which is where the role of China, of Russia, who also are somewhere around these talks, as well as key regional parties, need to be also very much taken into account. You asked me about the significance of this. Islamabad is de facto a meeting of great powers and the regional powers on what is the most difficult and important conflict situation in the world today. It needs to show some results straight away, as I said, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and extending the ceasefire. But beyond that, of course, it's the nuclear issue. Of course, it's how do you ensure a new security arrangement for the Gulf, including the role of Hezbollah or the Houthis or the forces in Iraq. Those are the kind of things which are going to take a lot longer than, of course, this weekend.
You mentioned guarantees. Who can provide guarantees? Who would want to provide guarantees when we've seen one side attack the other side twice during negotiations? Isn't that a bit of an issue?
It is, which is why the big powers have to be involved, which is why China has been such a key player.
Can they guarantee what the US would do?
No, but what you do is you build a much broader international framework which builds the legitimacy, which is the basis on which, the foundation on which you try to then build the details into that a set of agreements. And ultimately, that probably takes us also to the UN Security Council. The United States could go with Israel, let's say, on an issue, and, you know, the whole thing. Blows up. But if the other big major powers are involved, that will be needed, even for the United States, to ensure that Iran comes to the table and negotiates in good faith. Then you're going to need that kind of international legitimacy.
You mentioned that it's important for Pakistan to show some results and quickly. From a, shall we say, negotiating or peace-building tactic or strategy, is it better to start, you might think it's better to start with some small steps that can be agreed to, but isn't that precisely what Iran said? It doesn't want to agree to just an extended ceasefire. It wants to get straight into bigger issues. It doesn't want to let go, I guess, of its leverage and then leave the bigger issues to be sorted out when it's left its leverage.
Well, that's why the discussion that's going on right now about the broader agenda and what needs to be agreed and what needs to be discussed with international guarantees is so important.
And are you hearing from people you're talking to that that's going well?
Right now, we're at a crunch point. There are
I'm
five
looking for any
or six
reason to be optimistic, Salman.
Well, I am cautiously optimistic, actually. I don't think, maybe with the exception of one regional state, Israel, I don't think anybody wants this war to restart. I don't think President Trump is necessarily looking for that, which is why he sent such a delegation. And of course, the Iranians also want to move on at this stage.
Okay. Salman Sheikh from Sheikh Group, former UN official too. Thank you so much for joining us here in the studio. Let's take a look at some of the day's other news. Temporary ceasefire has come into effect between Russia and Ukraine to coincide with the Orthodox Easter holiday. The two countries agreed to pause hostilities for 32 hours. They've said if either side violates the truce, the other will respond immediately. A similar ceasefire was put in place last year, but both countries accused the other of hundreds of violations. Yulia Shapovalova has more now from Moscow.
As Russians are preparing for Easter celebrations, the temporary 32-hour Easter ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine has come into effect along the entire front line. The question remains, though, whether it will last until the end of the day on April the 12th. Earlier today, both sides exchanged 175 prisoners of war each. The Russian soldiers were transported to Belarus, where they are now receiving medical and psychological assistance. Plus 7 civilian residents from the border Kursk region, captured by Ukrainians back in August 2024, have also returned to Russia. The UAE traditionally served as a mediator in this exchange. On Thursday, the sides also exchanged the bodies of the dead. Russia handed over the remains of 1,000 servicemen to Ukraine, and Moscow received 41 bodies from Kiev. Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky has offered to extend the ceasefire after Easter, but seems like the Russian side has not shown any interest in it, at least for now. Yulia Shapovalova, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his rival Peter Magyar have held their final rallies before Sunday's parliamentary election. The vote is seen as a major challenge to the right-wing Orban. He's been in power for 16 years. Orban's declining popularity, especially amongst young people, follows economic stagnation as well as political and corruption scandals. Step Vassen is live for us in Budapest. So, Step, any indication of whether Orban can hang on?
Well, Viktor Orban just held his very final election campaign rally here in the historical castle center of Budapest. And it's basically now up to the Hungarians to decide on Sunday. Orban, as you say, is really struggling for his political survival after 16 years. And in his speech, he called it a very tough campaign. And it was a very tough campaign, a very polarizing campaign in which he has called his contender, Peter Magyar, a puppet of Brussels. And he has actually threatened that there could be a war if Magyar would become the next prime minister. But he's also been appealing to the youth. As you say, the youth is really abandoning Orban. They're basically, there's an exhaustion among the youth of Orban. They really want change. There's a real appetite for change. If you see the Magyar rallies, I've been to a few of them, you see that there is a lot of young people there. They really want Orban to step down, to be finished, they say, because he has sort of destroyed the country. It's interesting to see that Orban, he had a real grip on the power here in the last 16 years, that even then, with the control of the media, the erosion of the democratic institutions, that it's still possible that people are really changing their minds, because what's really important is what hurts the most is, of course, the economy and the healthcare system. So that's where people are going to vote for, and not so much about the international issues that Orban has brought into this campaign.
And Step, talking about international issues, this is not just a local affair, right? There's a lot at stake here in terms of relations with the EU, which direction that goes in, and also European-Russian relations, right?
This is a very widely watched election around the world. Washington is watching closely. We had GD Vance here in Budapest just this week, fully endorsing Viktor Orban. Moscow is watching closely because Orban within the EU has been very helpful for Moscow by vetoing projects and funds for Ukraine. And of course, Brussels is watching closely because they had a lot of issues and problems with Orban in the last couple of years because he was vetoing all kinds of decisions. So it is definitely a very widely watched election. But voters will basically mostly look at their own personal issues when they're in the voting stations tomorrow.
Okay, we'll leave it there for now. Step Vassen reporting live from Budapest. Peruvians are set to choose their 9th president in 10 years, a decade marked by political upheaval, corruption, and increased crime rates. Sunday's election is considered crucial to political stability. But working-class Peruvians say they feel left out and ignored. Mariana Sanchez has more now from Lima.
El Carmen is the heart of Peru's black community, a small town known for its music and dance. Not a single candidate came to campaign here. Angelina Palma says El Carmen, like many remote communities, has been forgotten.
Many say that when a new president is elected, a lot of things will happen. I don't think so. People determine their own futures by fighting and working hard.
Apathy and 35 presidential candidates are not helping. Polls suggest at least 20% of Peruvians don't know who to vote for on Sunday. Most of the undecided live in rural areas, and most are women. These cooks run an initiative that feeds dozens of families, collecting bruised produce or damaged goods that can't be sold to distribute among those in need. This is the first time they've seen a ballot, and they are puzzled.
At first glance, it confused me because there are so many candidates, so many columns. We didn't really know how to vote.
They also don't know who to vote for and say there is little to hope for.
Our children are the future of the country, but what kind of future will they have if there's no support from the government?
1/3 of Peruvians, more than 10 million, live in poverty. Candidates have offered many different things: to resolve the growing violence with the death penalty, or resort to the armed forces to patrol the streets. Others want to expel Venezuelans or free former President Pedro Castillo. But for many people here, more than political stability and security, it is about making ends meet. Adela Bastidas says the next government is likely to promise a better future. Promises, she says, that have been made and broken before.
They've never thought of us as citizens. I don't really care who wins in the end because we're going to go about our lives like we always do.
Whoever is elected will become Peru's 9th president in 10 years. Many here say their only hope is that the new leader finish the 5-year term. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, Lima.
Iraq's parliament has elected the country's next president. Politicians in Baghdad chose Nizar Ahmadi in a vote on Saturday. Well, this came after parliamentary elections in November. Former President Abdul Latif Rashid withdrew from seeking a second term. He said he wanted to avoid weakening national unity. Voters in Benin head to the polls on Sunday to elect a president. Once one of West Africa's most stable democracies, the poll follows a failed coup attempt in December. And that's raising questions about Benin's political direction. Ahmed Idris now from Cotonou.
In the port city of Cotonou, these journalists planned their coverage of Benin's presidential election. The editor wants to focus on what matters most to voters.
The fundamental concern is bread and peace. That is first what concerns the Beninese.
Bread because of a growing cost of living crisis, and peace because of attacks by armed groups in the north. But Benin's political landscape has also narrowed since President Patrice Talon first came to power in 2016. There were 33 candidates in that year's race, but in this election, only 2. That's after a recent law effectively locked out most opposition parties. Finance Minister Romuald Wadanyi is widely seen as Talon's anointed successor. He's campaigning on a platform of stability and continued reform.
I believe he knows Beninese expect of him to build on the achievements of the current government that improve the living conditions of the people.
Benin's lone opposition challenger in the race is Paul Hunkwe, and he's trying hard to shake perceptions he's little more than a symbolic contender in a tightly controlled contest.
The government rolls out numbers, yet failed to build schools, or you build hospitals that only certain class can access. That's not progress. You need universal access to education and healthcare.
Beyond campaign rhetoric, it's everyday concerns that's shaping people's opinions about the vote.
President Patrice Talon's urban renewal program has transformed the financial capital Cotonou. But for many Beninese, this election is about more than infrastructure and impressive economic growth. Many people here say they want to see greater political and economic inclusion and answers to lingering questions about December's failed coup.
Many say they will still turn out to vote, but some are less convinced.
They keep asking for our votes, but there's been no change in my life.
And while President Talon's economic record may drive some to the polls, analysts say many others may see no vote for peace and decide to stay home. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Cotonou.
Stay with us here on Al Jazeera as we continue our extensive coverage of the ceasefire talks between Iran and the US.
This war has divided this country. They had to be stopped. It's a regime that is nuts.
We could call it a tremendous success right now.
What do we know about how the president is making decisions, like agreeing to the ceasefire?
What he is listening to is instinct over intelligence.
We can all breathe a limited sigh of relief, but we're still not anywhere near the end of this story.
This is America, every weekday on Al Jazeera.
That would precipitate an attack against American forces.
To prevent Iran from getting nukes.
There is no coherent strategy, and you can see that's reflected in the media coverage.
Many American media see it like a video game. From the graphics on the screen to who they speak to, war for them is big business.
We saw this exact same pattern happen in Gaza. The same lazy, flattened reporting that we saw in Gaza when it comes to the war on Iran.
The Listening Post decodes the media on Al Jazeera. Hearing the facts.
A busy day for Iran today could mean when Iran retaliates, it will be a busy day for cities in the Gulf.
With the latest global news and insightful documentaries, Al Jazeera's teams across the world bring you closer to the heart of the story.
Hey there, I'm Scott McLean. This is Al Jazeera with our extensive coverage of high-level negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. Coming up, historic face-to-face talks between the U.S. and Iran. Negotiations to end the war continue into the night in Pakistan. Vice President J.D. Vance is leading the U.S. delegation. He is optimistic about the outcome of negotiations. More death and destruction in southern Lebanon. Israel continues its strikes despite an agreement for talks with Lebanon. Ukraine and Russia exchange prisoners as a temporary ceasefire goes into effect to coincide with Orthodox Easter. U.S. and Iranian officials are meeting face-to-face in Pakistan to try to end the war. Iranian state media reports that last efforts are being made to close any gaps. That's a direct quote. Iran's Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi are leading Tehran's delegation. Ahead of the talks, they set preconditions, including the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets and an end to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. The talks in Islamabad are the highest-level negotiations between Washington and Tehran since Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Vice President J.D. Vance is leading the U.S. side. Washington wants the Strait of Hormuz to be opened without any limitations. Before the negotiations, the U.S. said it is open to significant sanctions relief, but only in exchange for Iranian concessions on nuclear development. These negotiations come after Israel and the U.S. launched attacks on Iran 6 weeks ago. More than 3,000 Iranians have been killed and at least 26,500 people injured since this also struck multiple civilian facilities, including hospitals, universities, and schools. And the conflict has also had widespread effects, of course, across the world. Well, we'll get reaction on the talks from Iran in just a moment, but first let's speak to our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett, who is in Islamabad, where the meeting is taking place. So, Kimberly, what do we know exactly about where things stand and if we're actually going to see a second day of these talks?
Well, technically, we are into the second day of talks, although the first day hasn't broken up yet, only because it is now Sunday here as about 2 minutes ago. It is midnight here in Islamabad. What I can tell you is that at the Serena Hotel, that building with the lights on behind me that you see in the distance, that is where these two delegations are meeting. And what we are hearing, Al Jazeera has learned from their sources inside the hotel, intending to stay the night. In other words, they will continue. What we know is that these discussions are still ongoing, and they have no plan to leave Islamabad immediately after they break up from their working sessions. We also know that an exchange of drafts at the delegate level has indicated there is some progress on a basic framework. Now, that means a basic framework on points of agreement is what we are to assume. But what those points of agreement are is still very unclear. Now, we know that the plan, although there was no official schedule for J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, was to be on the ground for about 24 hours. What we know is that he is now into his roughly 13th hour on the ground. So that means that if they stick to that schedule and don't prolong it, the clock is ticking. So again, we know that these talks are still ongoing. They had been going into breakout sessions. Now they are back together again with the Pakistanis still acting as the intermediary between the teams of Iranian delegation and the United States. And of course, the big issues, the Strait of Hormuz, which seems to be one of the biggest contention points, according to our sources. We are unclear if this breakthrough is coming in terms of a framework on that issue, but we know it was primary for the United States as well to see the strait opened, fully functional, and a free flow of traffic. So we're watching very carefully to see what comes out of the Serena Hotel at this hour as those meetings are still underway.
All right, Kimberly, sit tight. Let's go to Tehran now where Ali Hashim is standing by for us. So, Ali, as Kimberly points out, the Iranians are going to stay the night, and according to J.D. Vance's schedule, he may still have some runway to stay in Islamabad as well. The foreign minister, though, the Iranian foreign minister has made clear from the outset that trust levels are pretty low. So I wonder, what signals are we getting from the Iranian side as to how things are going thus far?
Well, we're hearing a lot, Sam, from the Iranians. We're hearing about some issues that there were prior to the deal, such as the ceasefire in Lebanon and the release of frozen funds. And now we're also hearing the possibility that there might be another session. Main issue is what Kimberly was mentioning, the basic framework. Whenever there's a framework agreed on, and we see more experts getting into the negotiations, then things are working and going in the right direction. As far as we don't have any clear picture or clear image on what has been agreed upon. I mean, right now we know very well that the United States had several red lines that it wants Iran not to cross, and it wants concessions from Iran on the nuclear program, the ballistic missiles program, and the regional intervention or regional allies. Now, there's a new element that entered the whole equation, which is the Strait of Hormuz. Will there be a possibility to see a swapping the opening of the strait for one of these three, and then going forward with more and more developments? This is what everyone is waiting to see, whether it's going to happen or not.
All right, let's see. Ali Hashim for us there in Tehran. Thank you. Let's go back to Kimberly, who is in Islamabad. So, Kimberly, I'm very interested in sort of the logistics of all of this because, as you pointed out, talks began earlier, they braked for dinner, and then they carried on. So do we know if the two sides actually ate dinner together? I mean, are there any signs that there is any kind of rapport or goodwill being built up between the two sides?
This has been highly secretive. We are, as the media, kept far away from the Serena Hotel, and between us and the delegates are very tight security, not just the police, but also the military, with pretty high-tech weaponry that they are carrying, and it is out and exposed as a deterrent. So what I can tell you is that in terms of who sat with whom for dinner, we don't have answers to that yet. There is a traveling pool with the vice president, but they have been reporting that they are getting very few details too. And there's a reason for that, and that is because this is a highly sensitive negotiation, and there is already distrust between the United States and Iran. It would be very bad on the part of the United States to be leaking information and perhaps building up even more distrust that exists between the parties, given the fact that there have not been talks between these two groups for face-to-face since 1979. The United States delegation is being very protective of all that is taking place inside that hotel. But these are details that will come out in time, and so we're watching carefully for that. But again, the bottom line in all of this is I can't underscore just how sensitive these talks are, because the fact of the matter is the U.S. president, who is not in attendance here in Islamabad, has been injecting himself through social media, talking about how Iran is losing, and that he has, in recent days, he has posted on Truth Social that he is making sure the military stays in the region, continues to reset and arm itself again. And if these talks fail, he will exercise the military option, as has been the case for more than a month. So it is that backdrop that these discussions are taking place, and that these diplomats know it could go wrong at any moment, and we could see the end of this pause in fighting that currently is in place. So that is why we're not hearing anything coming out of the hotel. But what we know is once those meetings break up, that's when the leaks will begin.
All right, well, perhaps in this case, secrecy may actually be a good sign. But as you say, let's see. Kimberly Halkett for us there in Islamabad. Thank you. Well, Iranian and American conditions for ending the war appear to show some pretty major differences. Washington's list hasn't been published yet, but the U.S. media leaks suggest it includes a 30-day ceasefire, while Iran is calling for a complete halt to strikes and guarantees against future attacks. The U.S. wants 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities to be dismantled, Tehran to never develop a nuclear weapon, and to stop the enrichment of uranium. Tehran rules out any restrictions on its enrichment program. The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is a key U.S. demand. Iran wants guarantees it gets sovereignty over the waterway. The U.S. also wants Iran to end its support for regional non-state allies such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. But Iran is demanding the U.S. and Israel stop the war on all fronts, including fighting its regional proxies. The latest Israeli strikes have killed at least 10 people in southern Lebanon. Residential areas in the Nabatea district have been hit as attacks spread across several towns. Health officials say homes, infrastructure, and civilian facilities have been heavily damaged. Rescue teams continue to assess the damage and search affected areas. Well, another major discussion point in the Pakistan-sponsored talks is Iran's demands on the U.S. Tehran wants frozen assets to be released and the lifting of economic sanctions. In 1979, the U.S. imposed sanctions in response to the seizure of the U.S. embassy and its staff in the Iranian capital. Now, they continued because of Tehran's support for armed groups and its nuclear ambitions. Iran wants to regain access to funds held in major global banks, estimated to be worth more than $100 billion. They could help its struggling economy. Nearly half of Iranians live below the poverty line. Since 2025, its economy has struggled with a sharp currency collapse and surging inflation. All right, joining us from Washington, D.C. is Gordon Gray. He is a former U.S. ambassador and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Ambassador, thank you so much for being on the program today. So, given your